Silas Crow grabbed Clara Mercer by the wrist in front of the entire town, and not a single man moved to stop him. Not the sheriff, not the banker standing 3 feet away, not the dozen men who had known her father for 20 years. They all looked at their boots like the ground suddenly got real interesting. Clara was 23 years old, standing in the middle of Bitter Creek's Main Street in a dress she'd worn twice already that week because it was the only decent one she had left. Her father was 4 days in the ground, and the most powerful man in 3 counties was announcing loudly that she now belonged to him. If that had been your daughter, your sister, what would you have done? Before you answer, I need you to stay right here with me. Because what happened next in that frozen Wyoming street in October of 1882 changed everything. Not just for Clara, for this entire part of the West. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button and the bell because we tell stories like this every week. Stories that will shake you, move you, and remind you what it means to be human. Drop your city and country in the comments right now. I want to know how far this story has traveled, and if it moves you, and I promise it will leave us a like. It keeps these stories alive now. Let's go back to that street. Let's go back to the moment the saloon doors exploded open. The trouble with Bitter Creek was that everybody knew what kind of man Silas Crow was, and nobody did a thing about it. That was the deal the town had made with itself sometime around 1876, when Crow first rode in with 30 men, a railroad contract, and enough money to buy half the county before Christmas. He'd been buying things ever since: water rights, grazing land, judges, the sheriff's salary, and somewhere along the way, the collective spine of an entire community. By October of 1882, Silas Crow was 51 years old, built like a man who had once been strong and had gone to fat without being any less dangerous for it. He wore good coats and bad intentions, and he had a way of smiling that never reached his eyes, the kind of smile that told you he was already calculating what you were worth to him and how little he intended to pay for it. Elias Mercer had known Crow for 7 years. In all that time, he had never once trusted him. That was the one smart thing Elias ever did. The problem was that he borrowed money from him anyway. Elias Mercer was not a stupid man. He was a man caught between something enormous and the ordinary limits of what one person could do alone. He ran the bank in Bitter Creek, a modest operation, 2 clerks, a safe that was better than it looked, and a reputation for fairness that counted for something in a place where fairness was not always fashionable. He had raised Clara alone since she was 11, after her mother died of fever 3 winters running. He had taught her to read balance sheets before she was 14. He had told her once, when she was 17 and furious about something small, that the most important thing a person could do was stay standing when everything else fell down. He did not know that he was describing what she would have to do after he was gone. Crow had extended Elias a loan of $5,000 in the spring of 1880, and Elias had taken it for reasons that made complete sense at the time and would destroy him completely 2 years later. He needed the capital to secure a land acquisition in the Badlands, a stretch of ugly, cracked earth that nobody else wanted, that didn't support grazing, that had no obvious water, that most people in the territory would have laughed at you for wanting. Elias bought it anyway, and he told nobody why, not Clara. Not his 2 clerks, nobody, Crow being Crow, found out. Not right away. But eventually, he had a talent for sniffing out secrets the way a bad dog sniffs out something buried. What Crow discovered and what he spent the next 2 years carefully engineering a way to acquire was that beneath those worthless Badlands acres, there was gold. Not a trace amount, not a rumor. A genuine, significant, extraordinary deposit that Elias Mercer and a man named Jonah Rusk had identified together, quietly, carefully, using methods that neither of them advertised because they understood very well what would happen if the wrong people found out. The wrong people found out. Elias Mercer died in August of 1882. The official story was a fall from his horse on the East Ridge Road. The horse came back alone. Elias didn't come back at all. The county coroner, a man whose continued employment depended on Crow's goodwill, ruled it an accident in under 20 minutes. Clara knew her father. Her father did not fall off horses. But knowing a thing and being able to prove it are two entirely different problems, and Clara Mercer was suddenly a 23-year-old woman with no father, no money, a bank that was hemorrhaging debt, and a town full of people who offered her their sincere condolences, and then looked away when Silas Crow's lawyer appeared on her doorstep 8 days after the funeral with a ledger and a very precise accounting of what her father owed. $5,000 principal, 17 months of compounded interest at a rate that seemed criminal because it was. Additional fees that the lawyer read from his papers in a flat, rapid voice that suggested he had done this before and expected it to be over quickly. The total came to just over $7,000. Clara had $46 in her personal account and a bank that owed more than it owned. She asked for time. The lawyer said Mr. Crow had been patient long enough. She asked what collateral might be accepted. The lawyer looked at her in a way that made her skin crawl and said that Mr. Crow had some thoughts about that and that Mr. Crow would like to discuss them with her personally. She refused to meet with Crow. She spent 2 weeks trying to find help attorneys, territorial officials, other creditors, anyone. Nobody wanted to get between Clara Mercer and Silas Crow. Not over $5,000, not over $50,000. Crow was the kind of problem that other people's problems stayed well away from. On the morning of October the 14th, Crow stopped waiting. He sent 4 men to Clara's house before dawn. Not to arrest her, there was nothing to arrest her for. Just to escort her, they said. Mr. Crow wanted to resolve the matter publicly, before witnesses, so there could be no dispute about the outcome. They were very polite about it. One of them offered to carry her coat. She didn't take the coat. She walked out into the cold morning air with her chin up and her hands steady and her heart going at twice its normal speed because she had figured out 2 things at approximately the same moment. First, that she had no way out of this, and second, that she was not going to let Silas Crow see her afraid. That was the thing about Clara Mercer. She was not made of the material Crow had assumed. He found that out later. That morning he didn't know it yet. Main Street in Bitter Creek was 2 blocks long and held together by habit and necessity rather than any civic pride. By the time Crow's men walked Clara to the center of it, maybe 40 people had gathered: ranchers, shopkeepers' wives, a few cowboys still rough from the previous night, 2 of the town's 3 clergymen. The sheriff stood on the far edge of the crowd with his hat in his hands and the look of a man who had decided very precisely how much of this was his responsibility. He had decided it was none. Crow stood in the middle of the street in his good coat with his hat pulled low against the October wind. He had a document in his hand, the debt notice, officially stamped. He waited until the crowd was settled and then he read it aloud. He had a carrying voice, the kind that didn't need to be raised to fill a space. Clara stood 4 feet from him and listened to him, read out her father's ruin to an audience of 40 people, and she kept her face still and her hands at her sides, and she thought about what her father had told her about staying standing. When Crow finished reading, he folded the document carefully and looked at her. "The debt is due," he said. "Today I know," Clara said. Her voice was steady. She had rehearsed being steady. "I've been attempting to arrange. Arrangements have been made," Crow said. He was not speaking to her anymore. He was speaking to the crowd. "The bank, such as it is, will be liquidated. The property will be transferred. And as for the remaining balance," he paused, not because he didn't know what he was going to say, because he wanted everyone listening. "Miss Mercer will accompany me to the Crow Ranch, where she'll remain until the debt is satisfied in full." The crowd went quiet in a specific way, the way people go quiet when they hear something they know is wrong and have decided, collectively, not to say anything about. Clara looked at him. She understood exactly what he meant. She understood that the debt would never be satisfied in full, because that wasn't what this was about. This was about the land. and about the deed to the Badlands acres that Crow hadn't been able to locate yet, because her father had been smarter than Crow gave him credit for. "That's not a legal debt settlement," Clara said. "That's something else entirely." "Call it what you like," Crow said. He stepped toward her. "The law here agrees with me." He glanced at the sheriff. The sheriff looked at his hat. Crow reached out and took Clara's wrist. His hand was large and dry and completely assured of its right to be where it was. The crowd shifted, uncomfortable, still silent. Someone's horse moved and stamped at the edge of the street. A woman near the back made a sound that might have been a protest and turned into a cough. And Clara, who had promised herself she would not be afraid in front of this man, who had told herself over and over on the walk here that she would not give him the satisfaction, felt the cold, clear, certain understanding that she was entirely alone in this street. That was the moment. The saloon doors at the far end of the street didn't open. They came apart, both of them simultaneously, driven by something that didn't knock and didn't hesitate. The sound of it, that flat, explosive bang of old wood hitting old wood, cut through the crowd, noise the way a rifle shot does. Everyone turned. They couldn't help it. It was the kind of entrance that rewires attention whether you want it to or not. The man who came through those doors was enormous. Not in the theatrical way of men who want you to think they're large. In the actual, physical, matter-of-fact way of someone who had spent years doing difficult things in difficult conditions and whose body had simply adapted accordingly. He was well over 6 feet, broad through the shoulders, wearing a coat of elk hide that had seen at least 3 hard winters. His face was weathered to something beyond tan, marked on the left side by a scar that ran from his cheekbone to his jaw, an old wound, healed badly. A story written in skin that nobody in Bitter Creek knew, and most people would have been afraid to ask about. He was carrying a sack over his shoulder. He walked straight down the middle of the street like the crowd wasn't there, and the crowd parted for him the way water parts for something that doesn't move around obstacles. He stopped 7 feet from Silas Crow. He looked at the hand on Clara's wrist. He looked at Clara's face. Then he looked at Crow. "What's the debt?" His voice was low, not theatrical. Just direct, the way a carpenter asks how long a board needs to be. Crow stared at him. "Who the hell are you?" I asked what the debt is. Something moved behind Crow's eyes, a quick calculation, the kind a man makes when he can't immediately identify a threat and isn't sure whether he should be worried. "The Mercer debt is 7,200. The man unslung the sack from his shoulder and dropped it on the bar of the nearest hitching post. It hit with a sound that was not the sound of leather or cloth. It was the sound of weight, real weight, the kind that comes from the ground. "Open it," the man said. Nobody moved for a moment. Then one of Crow's own men, curious despite himself, worked the leather tie on the sack and looked inside and took a step back. Raw gold, not refined, not coin. Unprocessed ore in nuggets, irregular shaped, the color of old sunlight, filling the sack to nearly 2/3 of its capacity. A fortune in a bag. The man looked at the crowd. "Someone want to weigh it?" Thomas Hadley, who ran the assay office and had never in his life been accused of anything but absolute precision, pushed through the crowd with his hands already moving toward his vest pocket, where he kept his loop. Took him 4 minutes. The crowd was silent for all of them. Even the horses seemed to feel it. Hadley straightened up. He looked at the sack. He looked at Crow. He looked at the man who had come through the saloon doors. 7,400 and change, Hadley said. Give or take the refining. The man looked at Crow. That clear it? Crow's face had gone through several colors in the last 4 minutes. It had settled on something dark and carefully controlled. Clara's wrist. "Who are you?" he said again, and this time it wasn't a question so much as a demand. "Nobody you need to worry about," the man said. He turned to Clara. In the daylight, his eyes were the color of deep water, not dramatically, not beautifully, just steadily, the way deep water just is what it is without caring whether you find it significant. He was older than she'd initially thought, mid-40s maybe. The scar was startling up close. The rest of his face was less hostile than it looked from a distance, though she couldn't have explained why she felt that. "My name is Jonah Rusk," he said. "Your father knew me." Clara felt something shift in her chest, not hope exactly, but the territory adjacent to it. She had never heard her father speak that name. But the way this man said it quietly, like he was used to keeping it private, told her that the absence of the name didn't mean the absence of the relationship. "The debt is cleared," Jonah said. "You don't owe him anything anymore." But staying here, he glanced briefly at Crow, who had gone very still in the way that dangerous men go still when they're making decisions. "Staying here is going to go badly for you, tonight or tomorrow or next week." "But it will." Clara looked at his hand. He'd extended it toward her, not grabbing, not commanding. Just offering. The choice was clearly hers. She looked at the crowd. 40 people who had watched Silas Crow put his hand on her wrist and said nothing. The sheriff who was still looking at his hat. The 2 clergymen who had discovered a pressing interest in the middle distance. She looked at Silas Crow, who was watching her with the particular expression of a man who was angry and patient at the same time, which was the most dangerous combination she had ever seen on a human face. She took Jonah Rusk's hand. Crow said very quietly, "This isn't over." Jonah didn't turn around. "No," he agreed, "it isn't." They walked north, out of Bitter Creek, into the beginning of the worst winter the Wyoming Territory had seen in 40 years, a damaged man who had spent years alone with a secret, and a grieving woman who didn't yet know that her father's death had been murder, or that the gold in that sack had come from land that was rightfully hers, or that the man walking beside her had been protecting her father's secret for years while trying to find the right moment to do exactly what he'd just done. She only knew 2 things with any certainty as the town disappeared behind them. Her father had known this man, and for the first time in 6 weeks, she did not feel entirely alone. Neither of those things made her trust him. Trust was going to take considerably longer. And considerably more than a bag of gold, scarred face, and an exit from a situation that still had Silas Crow standing in the middle of it, watching her walk away with the calmness of a man who already knew what he was going to do next. The cold came down hard from the north as they left the last building behind. Jonah walked at a pace that was steady rather than urgent, which told her he'd done this kind of thing before moved in the open without running. Running told the thing behind you that you were afraid of it. She matched his pace and didn't look back and didn't say anything for a long time. The wind was the only thing that spoke, and it was saying winter, winter, winter in a language the mountains had been teaching the plains for 1,000 years. Clara Mercer had just left behind everything she'd ever known, in the company of a stranger who hadn't explained himself, walking toward mountains she'd never been into in October. She was 23 years old, 4 days from the anniversary of her father's death, wearing a dress she'd worn twice already that week. And she had $46 and a deed to some Badlands property she hadn't thought about in weeks folded into the lining of her coat because her father had made her promise to keep it there, and she had kept that promise without understanding why. She was beginning to understand why. The mountains waited ahead of them, enormous and indifferent and real, in a way that the politics of Bitter Creek had never quite managed to be. Above the peaks, the first hard stars of evening were coming out. Clara put her chin up the way she had on the walk to the center of Main Street, and she kept walking, and she did not look back at the town or at Silas Crow or at any of the 40 people who had stood there and watched and said nothing. She had made her decision. Now she had to live with it. They walked for 3 hours before Clara's legs told her they were done. She didn't say anything about it. She wasn't going to be the one to ask for a rest, not with this man she didn't know moving ahead of her at that steady, unhurried pace that somehow covered ground faster than it looked like it should. But her feet were wrong for this dress shoes, the kind that were built for standing behind a bank counter and looking respectable, not for climbing frozen ground in the dark with the temperature dropping the way it was dropping now. By the second hour, both her heels had blisters that she could feel with every step. By the third hour, one of them had opened. She kept walking. Jonah stopped at the crest of a low ridge, not because he needed to, but because he'd been watching her gait change for the last 40 minutes and had done the math. He turned around and looked at her feet without making a production of it. "Your shoes are wrong," he said. "I noticed. Should have said something." "I didn't want to slow us down." He looked at her for a moment, with an expression she couldn't read, not impatience, not sympathy exactly, something more measured than either. "Slow is better than crippled," he said. "Sit down." She sat on a flat rock at the edge of the ridge, and he crouched in front of her and looked at her shoes the way a man looks at a problem he's going to solve, whether or not the problem cooperates. He pulled a strip of elk hide from somewhere inside his coat. He seemed to have a lot of things inside that coat, and wrapped it around the heel of her right shoe in a way that took about 90 seconds and would have taken her 20 minutes to figure out. "That'll hold till morning," he said. "Thank you." He stood up. "Don't thank me yet. We've got 6 more miles." She looked at the mountains ahead of them, dark shapes against a sky that was doing something complicated with clouds and starlight. 6 miles, in the dark, in October. "Do you live up there?" she asked. "Yes. How long have you lived up there?" He picked up the pack he'd set down. "Long enough." That was the end of that conversation. She found out later, much later, when she understood him better, that long enough meant 9 years. 9 years since Jonah Rusk had walked away from a world that had specific plans for what he was supposed to be, and had gone instead into the Wind River high country with a mule, a set of engineering tools, a season's worth of provisions, and a complete unwillingness to discuss it with anyone. 9 years of building and mapping and learning and living, according to no schedule but the mountains, which was the most demanding schedule there was, and also the most honest. She didn't know any of that yet. She just knew 6 more miles, and that her heel hurt, and that the man walking ahead of her had paid over $7,000 to get her out of a situation that she still didn't fully understand. That part bothered her more than the blisters. Nobody paid $7,000 without expecting something back. That was the first principle of every financial transaction she'd learned at her father's elbow. And she didn't imagine it stopped applying just because the transaction involved raw gold and an October Street in Wyoming instead of a ledger and a banker's office. She watched the back of Jonah Rusk's head as he walked, and she thought about what Silas Crow's face had looked like when he let go of her wrist. Not angry, not defeated, just recalculating. The way a chess player looks when an unexpected move changes the board, but doesn't change his intention to win the game. That expression had been following her since they left town. She could feel it at her back. They made the last 2 miles in silence, and by the time Jonah stopped in front of what Clara had taken for a natural formation in the rock face, her left foot had joined her right in registering serious complaints. He did something with a latch she couldn't see in the dark, and a section of what had looked like a rock wall turned out to be a door heavy. Built into the cliff face with a precision that was jarring in that context, like finding a Swiss clock inside a bear's den. She ducked inside and almost walked into a table. Jonah got a lamp lit within about 30 seconds, and the room came up slowly in yellow light, and Clara stood in the middle of it and tried to reconcile what she was seeing with every assumption she'd brought into the mountains with her. It was not a trapper's cabin. It was not rough. It was not the den of a man living at the edge of civilization because civilization had expelled him. It was a long, low room cut partly into the rock, built partly of timber so precise and tight that she could feel immediately that it held heat the way a proper structure does. Bookshelves covered 2 full walls, and the books on them were not dime novels or almanacs. She could read the spines from where she stood engineering texts, geological surveys, mathematical references, histories of mining operations in California and Nevada and Peru. Maps covered the table in 3 overlapping layers, some hand-drawn in a careful, exacting hand, marked with calculations and margins that had been filled up and continued on separate sheets pinned to the ones beneath. A second room was visible through a doorway. She could see the corner of a bed, a second lamp, another shelf. "You built this," she said. It wasn't a question. Most of it, he was hanging up his coat, Took 2 winters for the rock work. You're an engineer." He paused briefly, just briefly, Those are surveying instruments. She pointed at a wooden case near the door, the kind that held tools you didn't leave out in the weather. Yes, and those maps, she moved toward the table and stopped herself, because they weren't her maps to look at. What are you mapping? Jonah had moved to a small stove in the corner and was doing something efficient and methodical with kindling. He didn't answer right away, which she was beginning to understand was not evasion, so much as his natural pace, he thought before he spoke, which made him different from most men she'd met, who spoke and then occasionally thought about what they'd said. "Sit down," he said. "Your feet need looking at. I asked you a question." "I heard you." He got the fire started and stood up. "Sit down, Miss Mercer." She sat down, not because he'd told her to, but because her heel had started bleeding again, and she could feel it in her shoe, and the sight of blood had a way of clarifying priorities. He dealt with her feet the way he'd dealt with everything else she'd seen him do practically, without drama, without commentary about the state of her shoes or the foolishness of walking 6 miles in them. He had a medical kit that was better stocked than the one at the Bitter Creek doctor's office. He cleaned the blisters, dressed them, wrapped her feet in a way that actually made them feel better rather than just differently uncomfortable. When he was done, he made coffee, real coffee, not the burnt grain substitutes that had become common in town. He put it in front of her and sat across the table and looked at her the way a man looks at something he's been putting off dealing with. "Your father sent me a letter," he said, 6 weeks before he died. Clara set down the coffee cup, very carefully. "He told me Crow was getting close," Jonah continued. "He said he'd been careful about the deed, that he'd hidden it somewhere. Crow couldn't get to it without going through you. And then he said that if anything happened to him, I should." He stopped. "He said I should go get you." The fire popped in the stove. Outside, the wind had picked up, coming down off the high peaks in that particular way it had at altitude, not gusting but pressing, a steady cold weight against everything that stood in its way. "You knew about the deed," Clara said. "Yes, you knew where it was." "No, just that Elias had hidden it. I didn't ask where." "It wasn't my business where." She studied his face. The scar was less startling in firelight, just part of the geography of him. He wasn't looking away from her, which she appreciated. She'd spent the last 6 weeks watching men find reasons to look everywhere, but at her when she needed them to look directly at her. "What is on that land?" she said. Not a question, an opening for him to decide what to tell her. He was quiet for longer than felt comfortable. Then he leaned forward and moved 2 of the overlapping maps aside to reveal the one underneath a hand-drawn survey of a Badlands section she recognized immediately, because she'd seen her father studying versions of it for 2 years without ever explaining why. "Your father and I surveyed that land together," he said. 7 years ago, we found a gold deposit." He put his finger on a point on the map. "Here, approximately here. We couldn't be certain of the depth without boring, but the surface indicators alone were." He paused again, and she had the impression he was choosing words carefully. Not because he was hiding something, but because precision mattered to him, and he didn't want to overstate. "Significant," he said, "very significant." Clara looked at the map. She looked at the number her father had written in the margin, a number that she'd seen on the letter in his desk and dismissed as speculative at the time. "That's why Crow killed him," she said. The word "killed" sat in the room between them. Jonah looked at her steadily. "We don't know that it was." "My father did not fall off a horse," Clara said. "He had ridden that East Ridge Road twice a week for 11 years. In bad weather. In the dark, he did not fall off a horse." Jonah was quiet. "You believe it too," she said. "You believed it before you walked into that street today." He looked at the map. "Yes," he said. "I believed it." "Then say so." "Crow had your father killed," Jonah said. It came out flat and certain the way he said most things. And then he arranged to call in the debt to get the land. But Elias had moved the deed out of the bank before he died, and Crow can't file a claim without it. That's why he wanted you at his ranch. He thought Elias would have told you where it was. My father never told me anything about any of this, Clara said. I know. He spent 2 years studying these maps, and he never said a word to me about what they meant. He was trying to protect you, Jonah said, from exactly what ended up happening anyway. She picked up the coffee and drank some of it and put it down and was quiet for a minute. The thing about grief is that it doesn't just sit in one place. It moves around. It surprises you. She thought she was past the acute phase of it, past the first terrible weeks, and then Jonah said your father was trying to protect you, and something in her chest cracked open again, not loudly. Just quietly, the way ice cracks when the thaw begins. He hid the deed in my coat lining, she said. Jonah went very still. When he brought me my winter coat in September, he sat with me while I tried it on, and he made me turn around, and I thought he was checking the fit. He sewed something into the lining. He told me to wear that coat every day until the weather broke. She set the coffee down. I thought he was just being particular about me being warm. She reached into the left side of her coat, where the lining had a seam that she'd noticed was stiffer than the rest of it and had assumed was a construction difference. She worked at the seam with her thumbnail until it opened at one end, just barely, just enough to work 2 fingers inside. The document was folded to about the size of a letter. She put it on the table between them. Jonah looked at it for a long moment without touching it. That's the deed. I assume so. I haven't opened it. You should open it. It's yours. She opened it. Deed. And it was her name on it, not her father's. But hers, transferred to her 6 months before his death, in a filing that Crow's people had apparently never located because it had been done quietly, county, without the usual local record. And in her father's handwriting, in the margin of the document, 2 lines that were not part of the official text. Find Jonah Rusk. He knows the rest. Trust him the way I did. She read it twice. Then she folded the document and held it in both hands and looked at the stove. The way he did, she said. We were partners, Jonah said. For 5 years on and off, before I came up here permanently. Why did you come up here permanently? He picked up his coffee. Drank. Put it down. That's a separate story. I have time. Not tonight you don't, he said. Tonight you need to sleep. He pushed back his chair. You can have the back room. The bed's decent. There's a second blanket in the chest. Clara looked at him. You're just going to tell me to go to sleep? You've been awake for probably 18 hours, he said. You walked 6 miles in the wrong shoes. You've had one of the worst days of your life, and tomorrow you're going to need to think clearly, because what happens next is going to require clear thinking. So yes, go to sleep. She wanted to argue. She was too tired to argue effectively, which she recognized, which made her more irritated. She took the deed and put it back inside her coat and stood up, and her feet reminded her with considerable force about the events of the evening. Jonah, she said. He looked at her. Why didn't you come sooner? If you knew about my father's letter, if you knew Crow was moving on us, why did you wait until the street? He was quiet for long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. I came as soon as I got the letter, he said. It took 3 weeks to reach me up here. Then I had to come down, and I had to get the gold together, and I had to figure out what I was walking into before I walked into it. He paused. I got into town the night before. I watched and listened and tried to find a way to handle it that didn't put you in the middle of a street with 40 witnesses. There wasn't one. You could have come to me directly. Crow had men on your house, he said. 2 of them, day and night. You went to the outhouse and came back. They were counting minutes. She hadn't known about the men on the house. She'd felt watched but hadn't been able to confirm it, and the sheriff had declined to be interested in her feelings about it. So you waited, she said. I waited for the moment Crow would be in public, on record in front of witnesses. So when the gold changed hands, it was legitimate and witnessed and documented. Hadley waited. 20 people heard the amount. Crow can't say it didn't happen. He met her eyes. If I'd done it in private, it would have been a lot easier for Crow to make the debt reappear. It was the most she'd heard him say at once. She thought about it. That's very careful thinking, she said. I've had 9 years of practice being careful, he said. She went to bed. The room was small, and the bed was indeed decent real rope and straw and 2 good blankets. She lay on her back in the dark and listened to the wind work its way around the stone walls outside and the small sounds of Jonah still at the table. Moving papers, occasional footsteps, the creak of him settling in a chair. She thought about her father sitting across from her with that winter coat in September, checking the fit, making her turn around. The way he'd squeezed her shoulder when she faced him again, the way he'd said, "You'll be warm in this one," with a satisfaction that she'd thought was just his particular pleasure in practical things being done properly. He'd already filed the deed transfer by then. He'd already sewed the document into her coat. He'd already done everything he could think of to keep it out of Crow's hands. And then he died on a road he knew like the back of his own hand, and the horse had come back alone. And none of the 40 people who would stand in the middle of Main Street and watch his daughter nearly dragged away had thought to say a single word about the fact that Elias Mercer did not fall off horses. She was still angry. She realized that the grief and the fear had been sitting on top of the anger for 6 weeks, insulating her from it, and that now, lying in this room with the deed safely next to her skin and Silas Crow temporarily outmaneuvered, the anger was working its way back up. Good, she thought, be angry. Angry is better than afraid. She slept eventually. Not well and not long, but she slept. Morning came in through a single high window and landed cold and precise across the room. She lay still for a moment before she moved, listening. The wind had dropped. She could hear Jonah outside wood being split, the deliberate crack of an axe doing its work. She got up, and her feet were stiff and sore but functional, and she wrapped them the way he'd wrapped them the night before, or tried to, and it was less precise than his version, but it held. She found a wash basin and water that was cold enough to make her inhale sharply, and she used it, and she felt marginally more like a person than she had in several days. When she came out, Jonah was stacking wood against the outside of the lodge with the focused efficiency of a man who doesn't waste movement. He looked at her, gauged something, went back to stacking. "There's porridge on the stove," he said. She ate porridge, and he came in and ate some, and they sat at the table with the maps between them, and she decided that the time for getting used to things was over. "Tell me everything," she said. He looked at her across the table. "About the gold, about my father, about what you know about Crow, and about what you think happens next," she said. "All of it. Don't decide what I need to know. Tell me everything and let me decide what matters." He looked at the maps for a moment. Then he looked at her. "Your father and I met in 1875, he said. "I was working for a mining concern out of Denver. Survey work. Mostly they wanted someone who could read geology and do precise measurements and keep their mouth shut about what they found. I was good at the first 2. Something shifted briefly in his expression. Less reliable on the third. You told someone something you shouldn't have?" "I told the truth to people who didn't want it," he said. The concern had found a significant copper deposit on land that was being disputed. There were 3 separate parties with legitimate claims, and the concern wanted to move on the land before the claims got settled in court. I documented all 3 claims and submitted them to the Territorial Surveyor's Office, which was my job. The concern disagreed about that being my job. They fired you. They did considerably more than fire me," he said. He touched the scar on his jaw, not unconsciously, Clara noticed, but deliberately, like he was acknowledging rather than hiding it. "After that, I freelanced. Independent survey work. That's how I met Elias. He'd heard about the Badlands site from someone he never told me exactly who, and he wanted a proper geological assessment done quietly. He found me through a mutual acquaintance in Cheyenne." "What did you find?" "The first week, not much," Jonah said. "The Badlands looks like nothing. That's the point of it. The surface is mostly shale and eroded sediment and cracked clay, and if you don't know what you're looking for, you're not going to look in the right places." He pulled a map toward him and pointed to a specific area. "But here these quartz formations, the angle of them. The way they run in relation to the water table, which is deeper there than it looks, but it exists. He traced a line on the map with his finger. Gold follows that line, or it did several million years ago when the geology was forming. The deposit isn't at the surface. It's down, maybe 40 feet, maybe 60, in a vein that the shale has been protecting from erosion. We couldn't be certain of the scope without serious boring work. But the indicators, he stopped. It's the largest undeveloped deposit I've ever encountered. In 10 years of survey work, Clara sat with that. How large, she said. He told her a number. She picked up her coffee and put it back down without drinking it. That's why Crow killed him, she said. That's why Crow killed him, Jonah agreed. A man doesn't get between Silas Crow and that kind of money and survive being in the way. Your father survived for 2 years because Crow didn't know exactly what he had or where the deed was filed. Once he found out about the transfer filing and somebody in a county office told him, I don't know who, but someone did once he knew your father had moved the legal title, everything accelerated. He arranged the accident. I believe so. And then he called in the debt to get to me. He needed the deed. He needed you to either produce it or lead him to it. Taking you to his ranch, Jonah's jaw tightened. He would have found it eventually. He has patience and he has methods. The word method sat there and they both understood what it meant, and neither of them elaborated on it. He's going to come up here, Clara said. Yes. How long do we have? Jonah thought about it. He doesn't know where I live. He knows I came from the mountains, but the Wind River Range is a significant amount of mountains. He'll have to ask around, which means time. But Crow has resources, and someone will eventually tell him something useful. He picked up his coffee. 2 months, maybe 3. Less if he's motivated, and I think yesterday motivated him considerably. So we have the winter, Clara said, most of it. She looked at the maps. She looked at the shelves of books, the survey instruments, the engineering references. She looked at this man across the table from her, this scarred, careful, difficult-to-read man who had spent 9 years building something extraordinary in a mountain valley because the world below had proved too dishonest to live in, and who had come down out of his isolation for the first time to honor a promise to her dead father. Teach me, she said. He frowned slightly. Teach you what? Whatever I need to know, she said, to not be helpless when they come. I don't know how to survive up here. I don't know how to defend myself. I don't know enough about the geology to argue the claim's value in court, and I'll need to be able to do that eventually. My father spent 2 years preparing this, and I wasn't part of any of it, and I'm not going to sit in this cabin for 3 months being protected. She met his eyes. Teach me. He studied her for a long moment. She had the impression he was looking at her the way he'd look at a geological survey, not making assumptions, just reading what was actually there. That coat, he said finally. You need better boots first. Is that yes? It's yes to boots, he said. Everything else we'll see. It was not a warm yes. It was not an encouraging yes. It was a grudging, qualified. Let's see what you're made of yes, which was entirely consistent with everything she'd learned about him in the last 14 hours. She would take it. The days that followed had a structure to them that felt nothing like the life she'd come from. Back in Bitter Creek, her days had been built around the bank's hours and the town's social expectations and the careful, slow work of managing her father's decline into debt without letting it become public. Up here, the days were built around what needed doing, which was considerable, and the weather, which had opinions about everything and shared them constantly. Jonah was not a natural teacher. He was a man who had spent 9 years doing things alone, in his own way, his own pace, and having someone else in his space doing things at a different pace in different ways visibly cost him something. She could see it sometimes, a particular quality of stillness that meant he was preventing himself from taking something out of her hands and doing it the right way himself. She caught him at it once, early in the second week, when she was struggling with a knot in the rope system he used for managing firewood loads. She could feel him behind her, approximately 18 inches away, radiating the particular energy of a man who knows exactly how to fix something and is exercising significant restraint about it. If you touch this rope, she said, without turning around, I will push you down that slope. A pause. That slope is 15 feet. I'm aware of that. Another pause. The knot goes left before it goes right. She tried it left before right. The knot worked. She felt it settle with that particular solid feeling of a thing done correctly, and she tied off the end and turned around and found him approximately where she'd expected him, maintaining a neutral expression with some effort. Thank you, she said. You're doing the snow loading wrong too, he said. But that can wait. She laughed. She hadn't laughed and she couldn't remember exactly, but it had been a while. The laugh surprised her as much as it seemed to surprise him. He looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen on his face before, something briefly unguarded, and then he turned and went back to the lodge, and she was left with the rope and the firewood and the wide, cold afternoon, and the strange, unexpected lightness of having found something funny. He did teach her, slowly and without ceremony, and with a pragmatism that suited her better than encouragement would have. He showed her how to read the weather off the peaks, which cloud formations meant what kind of incoming conditions and how long before they arrived. He showed her the 3 approaches to the valley that a man on horseback could use, and the 2 approaches a man on foot could use that a horseman couldn't, and where you stood to see all 5 of them at once. He showed her how the rifle worked, not the revolver, the rifle first, the enormous buffalo gun, that she could barely hold level on the first day and could keep reasonably steady by the end of the second week. He did not compliment her on her progress. He pointed out what she was doing wrong and expected her to correct it, which was exactly how her father had taught her double-entry bookkeeping at age 14, and she found she responded to it the same way with a silent, stubborn determination to do the thing correctly until he had nothing left to criticize. The nights were long and the stove kept the lodge warm, and they talked. Not about the gold at first, or about Crow, or about what was coming. About other things. About the books on the shelves she read voraciously, and so did he, and they had opinions that did not always coincide, which produced the first real arguments they had, which were the first conversations that felt like conversations between 2 people who were being fully themselves rather than performing a negotiated version of themselves. She found out about the 9 years gradually, in pieces, the way you find out things about a person who isn't in the habit of volunteering information. The mining concern and the scar were the beginning. After that, a woman in Denver who had waited 2 years for him to come back from a survey job and had eventually, reasonably, stopped waiting. A younger brother somewhere in Pennsylvania who wrote letters that Jonah answered less often than he should have. A belief in the land and the geology and the honest mathematics of what things actually were versus what people wanted them to be. That had calcified over 9 years into something that was simultaneously his greatest strength and the reason he'd been alone for so long. You don't trust people, she said one evening in the 3rd week. I trust people exactly as much as they've given me reason to, he said. He was cleaning the rifle, which he did every 3rd day, with the focused attention of someone who understood what it was for. That seems correct to me. It seems lonely to me, she said. He was quiet for a moment. Probably both, he said. She thought about her father, who had trusted this man enough to sew a deed into his daughter's coat lining and write his name on a note that said, "Trust him the way I did." That was not a man her father had known casually or evaluated lightly. Her father had been slow to trust and careful about it, and almost never wrong. She thought about herself standing in that street, taking the hand of a stranger, and how the decision had taken about 3 seconds and had been one of the most correct things she had ever done. My father wrote good references, she said. Jonah looked at her. Something in his expression shifted that brief unguarded quality again, there and gone, like a light through a window when a cloud moves. He was a good man, Jonah said. Better than most. I know, Clara said. I miss him every single day. He nodded. He didn't offer words that would have been inadequate to the weight of what she'd said, and she appreciated that more than she would have appreciated comfort. The third week became the fourth became the fifth, and the first real snow came down and covered the valley in a silence so complete it was almost a physical thing you could hold. Clara stood in the doorway of the lodge the morning after the first big snow and looked at how it had changed everything, the shapes of things, the distances, the logic of how you moved through a landscape, and felt something shift in her understanding of where she was. She was not waiting anymore. She was not simply surviving until something else happened. She was here, in this vassal alley, with this man, with her father's deed next to her skin, and the rifle she was learning to shoot well enough that Jonah had, 2 days ago, said nothing at all after she put 3 consecutive shots into a spruce tree at 150 yards, which from him was approximately equivalent to a standing ovation. He was here, and Silas Crow was out there, and what happened next was going to be determined not by what Crow had, and she didn't, but by what she and Jonah built in the time they had before he came for them. That was the new arithmetic of her life, not the arithmetic of debt and ledgers and obligations. The arithmetic of preparation and terrain and the particular advantage that belongs to people who know exactly where they stand and have decided, clearly and without equivocation, that they are not moving. Inside the lodge, she could hear Jonah at the table with his maps, doing the same thing she was doing in his way, calculating, preparing, thinking about every possible approach to this valley and what he could do about each one. She stayed in the doorway a moment longer, looking at the snow. Then she went back inside and sat down across from him and said, "Show me the valley approaches again." He pulled the right map toward her without a word. "Horp 3, Louis. Vit du 6,000, 6,000. 500 the Lien Kate Lien Mike Vikak Van Chuk Chum Cochient. Befahoy Twite Doutain what Cochient Lien Mike Ki Gaplai. Moit Van Lien Mike Van Chuk. Kom Zoithiot Like Cochient Adofan Mui. Lien Kate Kak Fun Kwa Cochient what Kike Lien Mike. Suzum Cochient Tip Zua Kak Fun. Dui Chi Chu Day. Trying Ngat Quang Dot Ngot. Kom Suzum Kike Do Zom Hok Tiu De Fu. Fong Kak Katrient Mi Hua Ki Zom Van Zawo Kam Suk. Kathio Noi Tu Ba. Zudo Kik Ting Kom Viet Lan Man. Nunvit Kom Huan Hao. Hoit Twidi Tu Nien. Trangon Ngu Van Chung Sao Zoi Va Kum Thu AI Dien Hin. Viet Nunya Van Chuin Niep Kom Yu AI Kogang Ne Sang. Kyoto Kan Ngui. Kam Mil Ta Kwa Mut Ma Va Huan Hao. Kit Tuk Van Kom Zoi Tiot Van Sao Skotrient Kom Nyak Den Chua. Louis Chaloi Chom Muk Tin Yan Kom Nye Sang document. Chi Zan Bat Buok Kom Duk Swat Hient Chom Noi Zung Trent. Day Lamut Go Trent Dit Ein Huan Tuan Hu Go Duk Tao Za Chi Nyam Muk Dik Zai Chi. Kom Dek Up Hai Ngu I Zang. No Zuat Chen Sukient Kotat Ngui Tut Wak Kotrient Kotat. Kom Suzum Kak Kum Thu New Zuat Chen Wak Kotrient Kotat. Telgi Chep Wak But Gu Dio Zi Dung Tu. That Kak Nyen Vat Diadiem To Chuk Vasukient Vai Huan Tuan Hu Go. Louis Duk Biet Guan Chom. Nếu dat din zoi hant chalai, kom duk zung zuko, hay bit not ko da huan chin kom ma zom noid zoom. The maps became their language, not the only language between them. They had developed others by now, the shorthand of 2 people living in close quarters through a mountain winter, the particular efficiency of communication. That happens when you've stopped needing to perform normalcy for each other. But the maps were where they spent most of their serious hours, bent over the table with the lamp pulled close, Clara learning to read the topography the way Jonah had learned to read it, as something living rather than abstract. A record of how water and gravity and time had shaped the ground that was now going to determine whether they lived or died. She had gotten good at the rifle. Not Jonah good, she didn't pretend otherwise, and he didn't pretend otherwise either. But good enough that he had stopped making corrections and started just watching her shoot, which was its own kind of verdict. The buffalo gun was still almost too much for her at full distance, but she'd found a way of planting herself, a particular angle of the shoulder and a specific way of absorbing the recoil that was hers rather than his, that worked for her body rather than trying to approximate what worked for his. He'd noticed the adaptation without commenting on it, which she now understood was the highest form of acknowledgement she was likely to get from him. The revolver was different, Closer range, faster, the kind of weapon that required a different quality of nerve, not the patience of a long shot, but the decision-making speed of something that happens in seconds. He worked with her on that separately, in the afternoons when the light was right, setting up targets at varying distances and calling out which one while she was already raising the gun. She was better at it than he'd expected. She could see that he was better at it than he'd expected, though he would have suffered considerably before admitting it. "You're anticipating the target," he told her, one afternoon in the middle of December. "I'm reading where you're looking," she said. He stopped. "What? Before you call the target, your eyes go there. Just for a second. You don't know you're doing it." She lowered the revolver. "So I'm already moving when you call." He was quiet for a moment. "That's useful," he said. In a fight with multiple people, she said, "I imagine they'd do the same thing. Look before they move." He looked at her the way he sometimes did when she said something that required him to adjust his assessment of her. He was getting familiar with the look. She didn't find it as irritating as she once had. "Yes," he said, "they would. That was the 6th week. The valley had 4 feet of snow by then, and more coming, and the world below Bitter Creek and Silas Crow and all the machinery of what was moving against them felt simultaneously very far away and extremely close. The way a thunderstorm feels when you can see it on the horizon and count the miles by the gap between lightning and sound. It was in the 7th week that Jonah began doing something he hadn't done before. He started going out in the early mornings, before she was fully awake, and coming back 2 or 3 hours later with that particular quality of concentrated thought that meant he'd been problem-solving rather than hunting or checking traps. She watched him for 3 days before she asked. "The east approach," he said. "I've been walking it." She went to the map. The east approach was the widest of the 5 ways into the valley, the one that could accommodate horses without forcing them to single file, which made it the most likely route for a group of men coming in force. "What are you planning?" she asked. He sat down at the table and pulled a piece of paper toward him, not a map this time, but a blank sheet, and he began drawing something from memory, a diagram that was partly engineering and partly something she didn't have a name for yet. "I spent 3 years in the Colorado silver camps before I came up here," he said. "Not mining, evaluating mines. Looking at what the existing shafts had done to the surrounding rock, whether the operations were stable, whether they were going to collapse on the workers." He drew a line representing the valley floor, then another representing the east ridge. In that work, you learn a lot about what certain amounts of force in certain configurations will do to certain types of ground. Clara looked at the diagram. She looked at what he was drawing above the east ridge line, and she began to understand what she was looking at. "Explosives," she said. "Controlled placement," he said. "Not random. It's not what you're picturing. It's not about destroying the approach. It's about making the approach unexpected." He drew 3 marks along the ridge. Here, here, and here. The snow loading on these rock formations is already substantial. A precise charge at the base of each one, timed correctly, would send the snow down the slope in a controlled pattern. Not an avalanche, not enough volume for that, but enough to break a line of riders, separate them, push them into the secondary approaches where the terrain narrows. She studied the diagram. "You have explosives? I have the materials to make what I need," he said. "Blasting powder from the mining work, detonation components I've kept for." He paused. "I kept them because I'm a man who keeps things that might be useful." I didn't know for what. How long to set it up? 2 weeks of careful work, he said. Maybe 3. And I'd need to know exactly when they're coming, because the trigger mechanism has to be set no more than a day before. Maybe less, depending on temperature. She thought about this. "We don't know when they're coming." "No," he said. Which is the problem. They needed information from below. They both knew it, and neither of them said it directly, because saying it directly meant acknowledging that one of them would have to go down and get it. And the mountain in December was not a place you descended and returned from on a casual schedule. It resolved itself 4 days later in a way neither of them had planned for. The sound came at mid-morning, not from any of the 5 approaches, but from the South Trail, the steep footpath that came up through a narrow granite cut that horses couldn't navigate, and that Jonah used for his own descents when he traveled alone. Clara heard it first. She was outside splitting kindling, which she had gotten reasonably good at, despite the handle being sized for hands larger than hers, and she stopped with the axe raised because the sound was wrong, not the sound of an animal, and not the sound of the mountain doing what the mountain did, but the sound of a person moving badly through terrain, stumbling rather than walking, the specific rhythm of someone who is hurt and running out of the ability to compensate for it. She put the axe down and picked up the rifle she'd leaned against the lodge wall. She kept it within reach now as a matter of habit, which Jonah had started doing weeks ago, and which she had adopted without discussion, and she went to the corner of the lodge and waited. He came out of the south cut in pieces almost. First a hand on the rock wall, then a shoulder, then the rest of him, a man in a deputy's coat that had been brown once, and was now several other colors in addition to brown, most of them biological. He was using a stick that was too short for him as a crutch under his left arm, and his right leg was doing something that legs aren't supposed to do at the knee, and his face was the color and texture of old wax. He saw the rifle before he saw her. He stopped. He had to stop and breathe. "I'm not with Crow. I can see you're not with anyone," Clara said. "You can barely stand up." He looked past her toward the lodge. "Is Rusk here? Who are you?" "Evan Cole," he said. "Deputy out of Bitter Creek." He stopped again. He was swaying slightly, which was not a voluntary swaying. "Your sheriff sent me up here to find you. Your sheriff is another stop." "Your sheriff is dead." Clara lowered the rifle, not because she was certain about him, but because a man who was about to fall over was not the most pressing threat she'd encountered. "Get inside," she said. She got him through the door and into the chair closest to the stove, and she went and got Jonah, who came in from the woodpile where he'd been working, and took one look at Evan Cole, and went to the medical kit without being asked. The deputy's knee was bad, not broken clean, which would have been simpler, but twisted in a way that had stretched things that were not meant to be stretched, and torn things that would take months to heal properly. Jonah stabilized it with the focused efficiency he brought to everything medical, and Cole made sounds during this process that he clearly would have preferred not to make, and Clara held the man's shoulders when Jonah had to straighten the joint. Not because she'd been asked to, but because it was obvious the man needed something to hold on to. When it was done, Cole sat in the chair with his leg propped and his eyes closed and breathed for a while. Then he opened them. "Crow knows where you are," he said. Neither of them said anything, not exactly where, Cole said. But he knows the Wind River Range, this valley system. He's had men asking in every trading post and trapper camp between here and Cheyenne for 2 months. He looked at Jonah. Someone in the Shoshone encampment at Wind River told one of his men about a big man with a scar who traded furs out of the northern valleys. 2 weeks ago. "How many men is he bringing?" Jonah asked. 20 that I know of, Cole said. "Could be more." He hired Rafe Danner. The name landed in the room the way a stone lands in still water. Clara looked at Jonah. She could see from his expression that the name meant something specific and nothing good. "Who is Rafe Danner?" she said. Jonah answered without looking at her. "Gunfighter," he said. "Out of Texas originally. He's been working for wealthy men in territory disputes for about 8 years. He's very good at what he does." "What does he do?" "He wins," Jonah said. "That's what he does. He wins, and the people he's working against don't." Cole nodded, which confirmed something about Danner that he'd apparently seen himself. He came to Bitter Creek 3 weeks ago. Crow had been planning this since October. "Since," he looked at Clara, "since the street. When are they coming?" Jonah asked. "I don't know exactly. That's why I'm here. I don't know exactly." Cole shifted his leg, winced. "I was keeping track, trying to, but Crow found out. Somebody in the office told him I'd been asking questions about the Danner crew's supplies. He had me followed, and then he had me." The deputy gestured vaguely at his knee. "It wasn't an accident either. Same story as Elias Mercer," Clara said. Yes, ma'am, Cole said quietly. Same story. I got out of town because I was going to be the next chapter of that story if I stayed. He looked at her steadily. Your father was a good man, Miss Mercer. I want you to know I tried. When it happened, I tried to get someone to open an inquiry. The coroner, the territorial office. Nobody wanted to touch it. Clara nodded. She'd known this, roughly, but hearing it from someone who'd been there and tried was different from knowing it abstractly. How long did it take you to climb up here? Jonah asked. 3 days, Cole said. The knee happened on the first day. That it was. He didn't finish the sentence. The 3 days were probably not something he wanted to describe in detail. You need to rest, Jonah said. I need to tell you what I know first, Cole said. Crow is going to come up the east approach. That's the intel I had before I left. Danner surveyed the valley approaches from below, as much as he could see, and he recommended the east approach for the main party. Crow has maps of the range, not detailed ones, but enough to know the general terrain. He looked at Jonah's own maps on the table. Nothing like what you've got. Jonah was already at the table, looking at the east approach diagram he'd drawn the previous week. Danner's good, Cole said. He'll send scouts ahead. 2, maybe 3 men before the main party. They'll know about ambush. Everyone knows about ambush in theory, Jonah said. He was making marks on the diagram. They won't know about this valley specifically. What's your plan? Cole asked. Working on it, Jonah said. Cole looked at Clara. She recognized the look the one men gave her when they were trying to figure out what category she fit into, now that the obvious categories had proved insufficient. Can you fight? He asked her. I'm getting there, she said. She can shoot, Jonah said, from the table, without looking up. It was the most direct endorsement he'd given her in 8 weeks, and he delivered it like a notation in a margin, factual, efficient, moving on immediately. But she felt it nonetheless. Cole nodded. He looked like a man who had used up a significant portion of his available resources getting to this point, and was now running on something finer and less renewable than energy. Rest, Clara said. We'll talk more when you've slept. He didn't argue. She got him to the spare blankets Jonah kept in the back room, and he was asleep before she'd even left the doorway. She went back to the table. Jonah was still on the east approach diagram, but he'd spread 2 additional maps beside it now and was working something out that involved all 3 simultaneously. She could see the geometry of it, the way he was triangulating positions, and she understood enough now to read the basic logic. 3 weeks, she said. Maybe 4 if the weather slows them. The weather will slow them, he said, but Danner won't let Crow wait past January. The longer they wait, the more time we have to prepare, and men like Danner know that. So 2 weeks, she said, realistically, possibly less. She sat down across from him and pulled the closest map toward her. She studied the east approach, the secondary approaches, the valley floor, the positions she'd learned over the past 2 months. She thought about 20 men with horses and a professional gunfighter who was very good at winning. Tell me what you're thinking, she said. The east approach has 3 natural bottlenecks, he said. He pointed to each one on the map, here at the granite cut, here where the trail narrows above the creek, here at the tree line before it opens into the valley. If I can control all 3, the explosives at the first one, she said. Drive them to single file. And here, he pointed to the second bottleneck. I've been building a tripwire system for 2 weeks. Wire across the trail attached to, he hesitated, to something that will announce their arrival loudly enough that we hear it from the lodge. An alarm. More than an alarm, he said. The wire is at horse chest height. A horse hits that in the dark, going at pace, she understood. How many horses can you take out? Realistically, 3-4 at the front of the line. If they're moving fast and the leaders go down, the ones behind pile up. It buys minutes. He moved to the third point. Here at the tree line, the approach opens onto a clear sight line to the lodge. 200 yards of open ground. Anyone crossing it from the east is exposed. That's where I shoot, she said. He looked at her. That's where I shoot, she said again, more flatly. You can't cover the west approach and the east at the same time. The west is the secondary route. If Danner is smart, he is, Jonah said. Then he splits the group. Main force comes east to draw attention. Smaller group goes west to flank. She tapped the map. You handle the west. I handle the tree line approach. He was quiet. I can make that shot, she said. 200 yards open ground. I've been doing it for 6 weeks, at stationary targets, he said. Men on horses are not dramatically faster than stationary targets at 200 yards, she said. Not if I'm already positioned. He looked at the map. He looked at her. He was doing the calculation. She could see him doing it, not whether she was right, because she was right, and they both knew it, but whether he could bring himself to put her at that position instead of something safer. There isn't a safer position, she said. If 20 men get to the lodge doesn't matter anymore. Picked up the pencil and made a mark on the map at the tree line clearing. You'd need to be here before first light, he said. A full day before they arrive, minimum. You dig in and you wait. I know how to wait, she said. It will be very cold, he said. You can't have a fire. You can't move much. The smoke or the movement could give away the position. I know what cold is, she said. I've been in this valley for 2 months. It's different when you're stationary, he said, for hours. Possibly all night. I can do it, she said. He made another mark on the map, a trajectory line from her position to the tree line approach. He measured something with his fingers she'd learned. This was his way of doing calculations without tools, a precision built from years of doing it until it was as accurate as most instruments. I'll build you a hide, he said, covered, insulated. Something that holds some warmth without producing smoke. He was looking at the map, but she could see he'd moved into a different mode, not debating anymore, but implementing. I'll need 3 days to do it right, then start tomorrow, she said. He looked up. He had that brief, unguarded expression again, the one that came and went so quickly you had to be watching for it. She was watching for it by now. You're not afraid, he said. It came out more like an observation than a question. I'm terrified, she said. That's not the same as unable to function. He looked at her for a long moment. No, he said. It isn't. The next 10 days were the most purposeful of Clara's life. Not the busiest. Not the most dramatic. There was a quality to the work that was almost meditative, each task connected to every other task, everything building toward the same fixed point on the horizon that was getting closer at a rate she could almost calculate. She and Jonah worked in a synchrony that had developed so gradually she hadn't noticed it arriving, the way you don't notice morning arriving, just suddenly realize it's light. Cole recovered enough to be useful by the 4th day. His knee was not going to be right for months, and he knew it, but he could move carefully, and he had knowledge she and Jonah didn't. He knew the faces of Danner's crew, had seen several of them in Bitter Creek, could describe their habits and methods with the detail of a man who had spent weeks watching them with the particular attention of someone who understood that his life might depend on what he noticed. Danner always sends 2 scouts, Cole told them on the 5th day. He was sitting at the table with his leg up, going through the approach maps with the careful attention of someone who'd been a deputy long enough to think in terms of who comes from where and when. Never 1, never 3, 2. They come 12 hours ahead of the main party, sometimes 24. They look for signs of habitation, signs of preparation. They're good. They've done this before. What do they look for specifically? Jonah asked. Smoke, primarily. Tracks in snow that suggest someone knows the approaches. Anything that looks planned rather than accidental. Cole tapped the map. If they find the tripwire system on the east approach, they'll cut it and come back and tell Danner the valley is prepared for defense. Then Danner adjusts. So the tripwires can't be visible, Jonah said. They can't look like anything, Cole said. If I were the scout, I'd be looking for any break in the natural pattern. Anything that looks like it was placed rather than fallen. Jonah went out the next day and spent 6 hours adjusting the wire placement. He came back with ice in his beard and the expression of a man who had done the work to his own standard, which was the only standard he applied. Clara spent those days making the supply cache for her position at the tree line. Not just ammunition food, water in a form that wouldn't freeze solid, the minimum of what a person needed to stay functional for 18 hours in sub-zero cold. She made a checklist, which Jonah looked at once and said nothing about, which meant it was correct. She thought about her father a lot during those days. Not in a way that was disabling. She'd done the disabling part of grief earlier, in the dark weeks after his death, when the world had felt like a room with all the air taken out of it. This was different. She thought about him practically in a way that felt like conversation. What he would have said about the tripwire placement. Whether he would have approved of the hide position. Whether he could have imagined this, his daughter in a mountain valley, learning to survive and fight, preparing to defend what he'd spent 2 years protecting. She thought he would have been afraid for her. She thought he also would have recognized her, which was perhaps the same thing. On the 8th day after Cole's arrival, something changed. She felt it before she could identify it, a quality in Jonah's attention that was different, a tightness that had not been there the day before. He went out twice to check the southern overlook, the high point that gave a view of the lower approaches, and the second time he was gone longer than the first. When he came back, he went straight to the map table. "Cole," he said. Cole looked up from where he'd been sitting. 3 men came through the southern valley 2 hours ago, Jonah said. They didn't come up. They went back. He was looking at the map with the expression of someone running calculations. They were looking. Cole was quiet for a moment. "Scouts or advance party?" "Scouts," Jonah said, the way they moved. They weren't in a hurry. They were observing. "Then Danner knows the general location," Cole said. "He sends scouts before the advance, not advance before the scouts." "If you saw the scouts, the main party is 1 day out," Jonah said. "Maybe 36 hours. The room was quiet. Clara looked at the supply cache for her position, stacked neatly by the door. She looked at the rifle on the wall. She looked at the maps, all that work, all those hours, all those conversations about approach angles and trajectory lines and the particular behavior of men who know they're going into a defended position. "I need to move to the hide tonight," she said, "before they send anyone else forward." "Yes," Jonah said, "and you need to set the trigger mechanisms on the ridge charges." "In the morning," he said, "before light." "Cole?" She looked at the deputy. "I can hold the lodge," Cole said. He shifted his bad leg. "I can't run and I can't climb, but I can hold a door." She looked at him steadily. He was a big man who had walked 3 days on a ruined knee to bring them information he could have kept to himself, because it was the right thing to do. She thought her father would have liked him. "You hold the lodge," she said. "If anyone gets past the approaches and gets to the building." "Nobody gets past the approaches," Jonah said. He said it flatly in the same tone he used for geological certainties. "If they do," Clara said, not to Jonah but to Cole, "the deed is in the left lining of my coat. If something happens to both of us, you take it to the Territorial Surveyor's office in Cheyenne." "Not anyone here, Cheyenne." Cole held her eyes. "Nothing's going to happen to both of you." "If it does," she said. He nodded. "Cheyenne." She went to the back room and checked her pack one more time. Everything where it should be, nothing extra, nothing she'd need that wasn't there. Cold outside was moving toward the kind of cold that killed, and she knew that, and she packed for it with the methodical focus of someone who had been paying attention to cold for 2 months and intended to pay attention for a while longer. She came back out and put the pack on the table and looked at the lodge, the books, the maps, the stove going in the corner, the 9 years of careful building that Jonah had done here, the 2 months of something she couldn't put a clean name on that she and he had built between them. Jonah was at the table. He was looking at the map, but he wasn't studying it. She could tell the difference by now. She went to the table and stood beside him and looked at the map too. The Valley floor, the east approach, the position marked in pencil, where she would spend the night and the morning and whatever came after that. "When this is over," she said. He looked up. "When this is over, I want to talk about the mine," she said. about how we develop it. There's a right way and a wrong way to do something that size, and I want to do it the right way. And I think you know what the right way is, and I think I know enough now to understand what you're talking about when you explain it. He looked at her for a long moment. When this is over, he said. That's not an agreement, she said. It's not a disagreement either, he said. He stopped. Started again. After. We talk about it after. It was as close as he came to saying what she thought they were both thinking, which was that after was a thing they intended to have, that the valley and the mine and whatever came next were things worth fighting for, not just because of the deed and the gold and the justice of her father's claim, but because of what had been built here over 8 weeks of cold and work and honest conversation. And she wasn't ready to name that yet, and neither was he, and maybe you didn't need to name a thing for it to be real. She picked up her pack. I'll be in position before midnight, she said. I'll check the ridge charges at 4 in the morning, he said. By then you'll be settled. Be careful on the ridge, she said. The east face is icy. I know the east face, he said. I know you do, she said. Be careful anyway. He looked at her with that expression she'd been watching develop for 8 weeks, the one that had started as assessment and moved through something she couldn't classify and arrived at something that looked. In the lamplight of this room he'd built stone by stone over 9 years, remarkably like the way her father used to look at her when she'd done something that surprised him into pride he hadn't been expecting to feel. She went out into the dark. The cold hit her like a wall, and she leaned into it and moved toward the tree line, toward the position on the map, toward the long, cold hours of waiting that came before the thing itself. Above the peaks the stars were out in force the way they only got at altitude, more stars than sky. She didn't look at them long. She had ground to cover and a hide to reach and 20 men coming up the mountain behind a man who was very good at winning. She intended to be in position when they arrived. She intended to be ready. She intended to be the thing that Silas Crow and Rafe Danner did not account for in their calculations, because men like them never accounted for women like her, which was the most reliable mistake they made, and the one she planned to make them pay for. She moved through the snow without a light. She'd walked the route enough times in daylight that she knew it in her feet. The valley settled into darkness behind her. Somewhere on the ridge above, in the morning, Jonah would be setting the mechanisms that would determine how the east approach went. Down below, Evan Cole would be sitting at the table with his bad leg up and a rifle across his knees, holding the lodge the way a man holds a line not because he's certain he can, but because it's his and he's decided. And she moved through the cold and the dark toward the tree line, carrying everything she'd learned and everything she'd lost and everything she intended to take back. And the snow took her footprints as fast as she made them and left no trace that she'd been there at all. She reached the hide at 11:30. Jonah had built it into the natural root system of a fallen spruce at the edge of the tree line, where the forest ended, and the open slope began its 200-yard run down to the valley floor. From the outside, it looked like a drift of snow against a deadfall, which was exactly what it was supposed to look like. And the fact that it looked like nothing was the finest piece of construction she'd seen him do. And he'd done considerable construction in her presence over the past 2 months. Inside, it was just large enough, insulated with layered bark and packed dry moss that he'd harvested and stored before the snow came. It held the residual warmth of her body within about 20 minutes of her settling in. Not warm, there was no version of this that was warm but survivable. The difference between 15 degrees and -5, which at this altitude in January was the difference between functional and frozen. She arranged the rifle across the notched timber he'd set at the front of the hide, angled precisely toward the tree line gap where the east approach opened into the slope. She arranged the revolver where her right hand could reach it without looking. She arranged the ammunition where both hands could reach it without moving her body significantly, because significant movement made steam, and steam meant she was there. Then she waited. Waiting was something she'd gotten better at over the past 2 months, but better at was relative. She had never been a patient person by nature. Her father used to say she had a banker's mind and a cavalry temperament, which was affectionate and accurate, and explained why she'd spent most of her adolescence furious at the pace of things. But she'd learned, up here, that patience wasn't the absence of urgency. It was urgency held very still, like water behind a dam. The pressure didn't go away. You just stopped fighting it. She lay still in the dark and listened to the mountain. The mountain had a lot to say. Wind working through the spruce canopy above her, a rhythmic creak and sigh that had specific variations she'd learned to read. That pattern meant the wind was northerly and steady, not gusty, which was good because gusts moved snow in ways that complicated long shots. The creek below the east approach was frozen at the surface, but she could hear it under the ice, still moving, the sound of it carrying in the cold air farther than it would in summer. An owl somewhere in the trees to her east, intermittent hunting. She thought about Jonah on the ridge in the dark, setting the mechanisms. The east face is icy, she'd said. I know, he'd said. She knew he knew. She'd said it anyway, because there were things you said to people when you couldn't be certain you were going to see them again, and be careful was the compressed version of all of them. She thought about her father, not in a complicated way, not with the grief weight that the thought usually carried. Just simply, just him, the way he looked when he was concentrating on a ledger, the particular angle of his head. The way he'd said, "You'll be warm in this one," when he handed her the coat. The fact that he had been, in some ways she hadn't understood until now, preparing her for this her whole life, not for a battle in a mountain valley, specifically, but for the thing that made the battle possible, which was the decision to stand rather than yield. That was what he'd been teaching her. All those years of balance sheets and careful thinking and stay standing when everything else falls down. He hadn't known it would come to this, but he'd known it would come to something, and he'd tried to make sure she'd be ready for whatever that something was. She was here, she was ready. Or as close to ready as a 23-year-old woman who had learned to shoot a buffalo rifle in 8 weeks could reasonably be, which was, she had decided, close enough. She dozed once, briefly, between 2 and 3 in the morning. Not sleep, her body wouldn't fully commit to sleep in that cold, in that position, with that much adrenaline moving slow and steady through her system. Just a kind of suspension, a few minutes of something quieter than waking. She came back out of it to the owl calling once more, and the creak under the ice and the wind in the spruce. And she checked the rifle by feel and checked the revolver by feel, and verified that her fingers were still fully functional, which they were. At 4 in the morning, she heard the east ridge, not the explosion, the setup. A sound she recognized from the 2 times Jonah had demonstrated the trigger mechanism for her, a specific metallic sound carried down the mountain by the cold air and the particular acoustics of the valley walls. He was setting the first position. She counted her breaths. 8 minutes later, the same sound from a different angle. The second position. 7 minutes after that, the third. He'd been careful on the east face. She let out a breath she'd been holding for approximately 4 hours. Dawn came the way it always did at altitude in winter, not gradually but in stages, each one a distinct change in what you could see, the world assembling itself out of dark in pieces. First the peaks above, the snow catching the first light before it reached the valley. Then the ridge lines. Then the tree line on the opposite side of the open slope. Then the slope itself, the texture of the snow becoming visible, the shadows of each small irregularity casting themselves eastward. By the time she could see the mouth of the east approach clearly, the light was full enough for a 200-yard shot. She saw nothing yet. The mouth of the approach was still and white, and exactly as it had been for the past 3 months. She waited. They came at 7:15 in the morning. She heard the horses before she saw them, the particular sound of shod hooves on compacted snow, a sound that doesn't carry far but carries distinctly when you're listening for it. Then the first one appeared at the mouth of the approach, a big dark horse with a rider who was scanning the valley exactly the way Cole had described Danner's scouts scanning terrain methodically, left to right, without urgency, professional attention of someone who does this regularly and has learned that the thing that kills you is what you miss, not what you see. Two scouts, just as Cole had said. She watched them come out into the open slope and stop side by side and look at the valley floor. She could see them clearly now, two men, well armed, moving with the economy of people who'd done this before. They sat their horses for a full 2 minutes without moving, just reading the valley. She didn't move, didn't breathe more than she had to. She was, from where they were standing, a shadow inside a drift of snow against a fallen tree. She had tested this herself, had walked the slope in daylight and turned and tried to identify the hide, and even knowing where it was, she'd had to look twice. Scouts talked briefly, too low for her to hear, and then the taller one turned his horse and went back toward the approach, presumably to report, and the shorter one stayed at the edge of the slope, watching. One scout in position. Main party coming. She counted the minutes. She counted carefully, because the distance from the mouth of the approach to the first tripwire was approximately 12 minutes at a walking pace, and the main party would not be walking. They would be moving with purpose, because Danner would have told them that speed through a confined approach was safer than caution. Caution in a bottleneck meant spending more time in the kill zone, and Danner was experienced enough to know that. At 9 minutes, the ridge exploded. It wasn't the sound she'd been expecting, even though she'd heard the demonstration twice. In the open valley, in the cold air, the first charge came down off the east ridge like something the mountain had been holding for 1,000 years and had finally decided to say. Snow went down the slope in a wave that was controlled and specific, exactly what Jonah had engineered, not a catastrophe but a disruption. Tons of snow moving fast across the mouth of the approach at a point that was 8 seconds ahead of where the front riders would be. She heard the horses scream before she heard the men shout. The scout on the slope wheeled his horse instinctively and nearly went down in the process, the horse losing its footing and recovering, the man fighting it back under control. He was looking at the ridge, not at the tree line, not at her position. The second charge went 30 seconds after the first. Different angle farther north designed to catch the middle of the column as it tried to reorganize after the first disruption. She heard this one differently than she heard the first, not the initial explosion, but the aftermath, the sound of mass in motion, and the sounds of men whose ordered column had become something much less ordered. Then the tripwires. She couldn't see the wire position from where she was. It was in the approach, out of her sight line, but she heard it. First a horse going down hard, that specific sound, and then 3 seconds later a second horse, and then a confused overlapping of shouting and animal noise that told her the front of the column had just become a problem for everyone behind it. Jonah's third charge went while the column was still trying to sort itself out from the second. This one she felt in the ground as much as heard a low concussion that traveled through the snow and the frozen earth and up into the hide around her, and she understood that he'd placed this one low, aimed at the trail itself rather than the slopes above it, and that the east approach was now significantly less passable than it had been 20 minutes ago. Men were coming out of the approach now, not in a column anymore. Individually, in pairs, on foot and on horseback in varying degrees of control. She could see 8 of them on the slope, then 10, then 12. She could see that 3 of the horses had no riders, and that at least 2 men were moving wrong, one holding his arm, one limping badly. She found Jonah's math was correct. The charges had done what he'd said they would do, no more and no less, and the men coming out of the approach were disrupted and spread and had lost the organizational coherence that made 20 men dangerous. They were not 20 men anymore. They were 12 men visible on the slope and an unknown number still in or behind the approach, and they were looking at the ridges, at the smoke from the charges, at each other. Nobody was looking at the tree line. She let them settle for 90 seconds. Jonah had told her to do this, let the initial chaos pass, let them begin to feel safe in the open valley, let them start moving with purpose before you take the purpose away. It was the longest 90 seconds of her life. She identified targets the way he'd taught her. Not the nearest ones, not the loudest ones, the ones who were organizing, the ones who were pointing and giving direction and getting the others oriented. Remove the organizers first, he'd said, and the rest become individuals instead of a unit, and individuals are a different kind of problem. She found one of them at the front of the loose group, a man on a gray horse who was gesturing toward the lodge with the specific authority of someone who knew where they were going. She put her first shot through his shoulder rather than through him, because the shoulder of a man on horseback at 200 yards was an achievable shot, and she was not going to miss by aiming for something smaller. Came off the horse. The group scattered. She was already moving to the second shot, another horse. Another organizer, a man in a dark coat who had turned toward her position but hadn't found it yet, who was looking at the smoke from her muzzle, which she'd known was going to happen, and which was why she was already shifting left inside the hide. Second shot. The man in the dark coat went backward off his horse. They found her position on the third shot. She saw one of them point toward the tree line and shout something, and two riders began moving toward her, angling across the slope, and she took the third shot at one of the riders. Not a clean hit, but enough to change his direction. And then she pulled back from the firing position and went to the secondary position Jonah had cut in the back of the hide. From here she couldn't see the slope, but she could hear it. More shouting, the sound of horses being worked hard, and then a sound she hadn't heard before, gunfire from the west side of the valley. The secondary approach. Jonah was on the west side. She made herself breathe. She counted shots from the west 3, a pause, one more, and tried to read what the count meant. She could not read what the count meant because she didn't know what he was facing over there. She made herself stop trying to read it. A man's voice, close. Too close. 30 yards from the hide, maybe less, moving through the trees. She pressed flat against the back of the hide and held completely still and listened to the footsteps in the snow. One man, she thought, moving carefully. He'd found the general area from the smoke and was now trying to locate her specifically. 20 yards. She had the revolver in her right hand. Not the rifle, no room to swing the rifle in here, and at this range the rifle was wrong for the situation. The revolver was right for this, 15 yards. She could hear him breathing now, the exertion of moving through heavy snow, and she could tell from the breathing he was young and scared and trying not to be scared, which made him less predictable than a man who had accepted being scared. Scared men who were trying not to be did sudden things. He came through the side of the hide from an angle she hadn't expected, not the front opening but the eastern wall, where the snow had drifted against the bark insulation in a way that looked solid from outside and wasn't. He came through it in a shower of snow and bark fragments with his rifle swinging toward her, and she was already up with the revolver leveled at a range of approximately 4 feet. He stopped. He looked at the revolver. He looked at her. He was 19 years old, she thought. Maybe 20. Put it down, she said. He didn't put it down. He was calculating. She could see him doing it. And what he was calculating was wrong. He was thinking about the distance and the revolver, and whether she would actually fire. And men who had spent their whole lives in a world where women didn't fire were bad at that calculation. Fired. She hit the rifle stock, which shattered and spun out of his hands, and she had the revolver back on him before he'd finished flinching. Now, she said, down. He went down. He sat in the wreckage of the hide wall with his hands shaking and his rifle in pieces and his eyes on the revolver. How many on the west approach, she said. He shook his head. How many men did Danner send to the west approach, she said. Tell me, and you walk out of this valley. Don't tell me, and I put the next one somewhere that matters. He looked at her. She looked back. She meant it, and he could see she meant it, and that was the end of that particular calculation. 4, he said. Danner took 4 men west. He went with them. Danner himself on the west approach. She felt something cold move through her that wasn't the temperature. She looked at the boy. Because he was a boy, she could see that now, some ranch hand who'd taken Crow's money without understanding what he was getting paid for. Get up, she said. Go back down the east approach and don't stop moving until you're out of this valley. Anyone who tries to stop you, tell them the woman shot your rifle apart and could have done worse and chose not to. You understand?" He understood. He went. She came out of the wrecked hide into the cold morning light and moved toward the tree line fast, crouching below the ridge of snow that would silhouette her from the slope. From the sound of things on the east approach side, the battle there had reduced itself fewer shots, more shouting. A quality to the noise that suggested the organized attack had become something more individual and less tactical. The west approach was a quarter-mile through the trees. She moved as fast as the snow allowed, which was not fast but was faster than it looked, because she'd walked this route in daylight a dozen times, and her feet knew it, even if her eyes were working hard. She came out above the western approach in time to hear 2 shots in quick succession, and then silence. The silence was wrong. Silence after gunfire either meant it was over or it meant someone was moving carefully, and she couldn't tell which without seeing. She worked down through the trees to the high point above the western trail and looked down. Jonah was there. He was upright, which was the first thing she checked, but only barely upright, leaning against a boulder with one hand, the other holding his rifle at an angle that told her something was wrong with his left side. 3 men were down on the western trail. 1 was moving slightly. 2 were not, and Rafe Danner was standing 40 feet from Jonah on the open trail, revolver in hand, and they were looking at each other with the specific stillness of 2 men who have each run out of easy options. She was above them and to the right, in the trees, and neither of them had seen her. Danner was not what she'd expected, though she hadn't known exactly what she'd expected. He was not large. He was mid-40s, slim, wearing a good coat, and he had the face of a man who was completely calm in this situation, not because he was suppressing emotion, but because this genuinely was not a situation that produced emotion in him. It was a job. He approached it the way a carpenter approaches a difficult joint, with interest and without passion. "You're hit," Danner said to Jonah, his voice carried in the cold air, measured and almost conversational. "I've had worse," Jonah said. His voice was steady. His left hand was pressed against his left side, and the hand was dark. "Maybe," Danner said. He tilted his head slightly. "The thing is, Rusk, Crow's money is already in my hand. Walking away doesn't give it back. I'm a professional man. Walking away from a paid contract is survival," Jonah said. "Your men are gone. Whatever's left of your crew on the east side is either down or running." Danner considered this without apparent distress. "I've worked with smaller margins," he said. "Not smaller than this," Jonah said. Danner raised his revolver. Clara stepped out of the tree line. She had the rifle up, and at this distance 40 feet, slightly above and right of Danner's position, the rifle was not necessary for accuracy, but it was necessary for what she needed it to communicate, which was that she had been here for at least 30 seconds, which meant she'd had 30 seconds to decide whether to shoot and had not shot, which meant she was not panicking, which meant Danner needed to add her to his calculation before he finished it. He turned his head. He looked at her with those flat professional eyes. "Miss Mercer," he said. She hadn't expected him to know her name. She didn't let it show, "Mr. Danner." "That's a large rifle," he said. "It shoots large holes," she said. "Step away from him." Danner looked at Jonah, looked at her. Did the geometry, which she could see him doing angles, distances, whether he could bring the revolver around before she could fire, whether the rifle was actually something she could control at this range from a standing position. "You've been shooting today," he said. "Your shoulder is tired." "I'll manage," she said. "Maybe," he said, "but at this range, if you pull that shot even slightly." "I won't pull it," she said. He looked at her for another 3 seconds. Real seconds, counted she could feel each one. Then he lowered the revolver. Dropped it. Lowered it slowly. To his side, the professional courtesy of a man acknowledging a changed situation rather than surrendering to one. "Contract was with Crow," he said, "not with the land." "Not with you." He looked at Jonah again, something in his face that might have been as close as he got to respect. You built a good defense. Go, Jonah said. Danner put the revolver in his holster. He walked back up the western trail without hurrying, stepping over the man who was moving slightly, stepping around the two who weren't, and disappeared around the upper bend. Clara crossed the distance to Jonah in about 10 steps. He was still leaning against the boulder, and when she got close, she could see the extent of what was wrong with his left side, which was more than she'd hoped and less than she'd feared. How bad, she said. Bad enough, he said. I can walk. Let me see, Clara, let me see, she said. He moved his hand. The wound was high on the left side, below the ribs, an entry wound that had gone through at an angle that she did not have the medical knowledge to fully evaluate, and that therefore required her to apply the medical knowledge she did have and get him back to the lodge as fast as possible. She got his arm over her shoulders. He was considerably larger than her, and the weight was significant, and the walk back through the trees was the longest quarter-mile she had ever traveled. But she was in good physical condition after 2 months of mountain work, and she was angry, which helped. Not at him. At the general situation, at the accumulated events of the past several months, at the specific physical fact of Jonah Rusk bleeding in the snow because Silas Crow had decided that other people's lives and land were things he could simply take. I'm all right, Jonah said. He was walking slow and effortful, and with one hand pressed to his side but walking. I know you're all right, she said. Keep moving. The east side. I handled the east side, she said. He looked at her without turning his head, just shifting his eyes. How many? I don't know exactly. Several down on the slope. One in the hide that I disarmed and sent out. You disarmed someone and sent him out. He was 20 years old, she said. He was scared. He told me Danner had gone west and then he left. Jonah was quiet for a moment. That was your call to make, he said finally. Yes, she said. It was. They came out of the trees above the lodge, and she could see immediately that something had happened at the lodge. The door was open, which it shouldn't be, and there were tracks in the snow in front of it, multiple tracks, overlapping. Stopped. Jonah felt her stop and looked. Cole, she said. She got Jonah to the large spruce 20 yards from the lodge door, and he leaned against it with the rifle up, and she came at the lodge from the side, below the window line, the revolver in her hand. Came around the doorframe fast and low. 2 men were inside. One was down and not moving near the far wall. The other was on his knees near the stove, one hand raised, and Evan Cole was sitting against the side wall with the other man's rifle across his lap and an expression of considerable pain and equal determination on his face. 3 came, Cole said. He was breathing carefully, the way you breathe when something in your torso is unhappy. Got 2 at the door. This one made it inside. He looked at the man on his knees. He decided to surrender about 90 seconds ago. Clara looked at the surrendered man, then at Cole. Are you hit? Cracked something, Cole said. He tapped his ribs lightly and winced. Not the worst thing that ever happened to me. He looked at her, then past her at the doorway. Rusk? He's outside, she said. He needs the medical kit. Now. She got Jonah inside and into the chair nearest the stove, which was still going, because Cole had apparently maintained the fire throughout the entire battle, which was, she thought, exactly the kind of specific practical competence that distinguished useful people from useless ones in difficult situations. The surrendered man was in the corner, and nobody was paying him particular attention because he was the least urgent problem in the room. She worked on Jonah's wound with everything in the medical kit and everything she'd been paying attention to when he'd used it on other people. The bullet had passed through, that much was clear, and that much was good, and the damage was to muscle and tissue rather than to anything that would kill him in the next several hours if she did her job correctly. She did her job correctly. Her hands shook slightly while she was cleaning the wound, and she noticed this and told her hands to stop, and they did, mostly. He didn't make a sound while she worked. He watched the stove. Crow, he said after a while. She looked up. What? Crow came with them, he said. He doesn't lead from behind, not when it's something he wants this badly. He was on the east approach. She thought about the east approach. The organized chaos of the charges, the scattered men coming out onto the slope. She hadn't been looking for Crow specifically because she hadn't known he was there. She looked at Cole. Was Crow with the main party? Cole's face told her before he spoke. Yes, he said. I saw him in Bitter Creek when they were organizing. He was going personally. She stood up. Her hands had stopped shaking. She looked at the door, open on the damaged valley, the morning light coming through it, cold and clear, the sound of wind in the trees, and nothing else now. No more shots, no more chaos. Then he's still out there, she said. Neither Jonah nor Cole said anything, because there was nothing to say that wasn't obvious. Silas Crow was somewhere in this valley. His mercenaries were down or scattered or gone. His professional gunfighter had walked away, and Crow was a man who had spent 30 years taking things by force and arrangement and the careful application of enough resources to remove any obstacle. And every single one of those resources had just been taken off the board in a single morning. She picked up the buffalo rifle. Jonah looked at her from the chair. He was pale and his left hand was pressed against the bandaging she'd applied, and he could not stand up unaided right now, and they both knew it. Clara, he said, he's not going to leave, she said. You know that. He came for the deed, and he came to end this, and losing 20 men doesn't change what he came for. It just makes him angrier. So do I, she said. He's dangerous when he's cornered, Jonah said. Don't underestimate. I have never underestimated Silas Crow, she said. Not for one moment since the morning he put his hand on my wrist in front of 40 people who did nothing. She checked the rifle. I'm not underestimating him now. She looked at him. He looked at her. Everything they'd built over 2 months, every conversation and lesson and cold morning and honest exchange, was in that look, and neither of them had the time or the inclination to say what they were thinking, but they didn't need to. Because they were both thinking the same thing, which was that this was not the end of anything. It was the resolution of one chapter of a longer story, and that story had considerably more to it, and they both intended to be present for it. Cole, she said, keep pressure on that wound if he stops doing it himself. Yes, ma'am, Cole said. She went out into the cold morning with the rifle and her father's deed next to her skin and 23 years of accumulated reasons, and she went to find Silas Crow. He wasn't hard to find. He was standing in the center of the valley floor, 40 yards from the lodge, in the open, which told her immediately that he'd seen what happened to his men and had made a calculation about tactics. The tactics were gone. What was left was Silas Crow with a revolver in his hand and the expression of a man who had one move remaining and knew it and had decided to make it. He was looking at the lodge when she came out of it. He shifted his gaze to her. He looked at the buffalo rifle. He looked at her face. You're alone, he said. Yes, she said. He glanced past her toward the lodge door. Rusk is hit. He's alive, she said. For now, Crow said. He hadn't raised the revolver. He was holding it at his side with the specific ease of a man who has carried one for 30 years. This doesn't change anything, you understand. You might have won this morning. But I have people in Cheyenne, in Denver, in the territorial offices. I have lawyers and I have connections that a mountain man and a banker's daughter cannot. My father's name was Elias Mercer, Clara said. He ran the bank in Bitter Creek for 11 years. He was fair to people and honest about money in a place where both of those things were unusual, and he died on a road he'd ridden 1,000 times because you needed his land and couldn't afford to let him keep it. Crow's jaw tightened. I want you to hear his name, she said. Before this ends, I want you to have heard it. Put down that rifle, Crow said. You're not going to. He raised the revolver, and she had known he was going to because she'd been watching his shoulder the same way she'd learned to watch Jonah's, reading where the body committed before the hand moved, and she was already raising the rifle when his arm came up. The buffalo gun at 40 yards was not a precise weapon in the sense of surgical precision. It was precise in the sense of complete and final. She put the shot where she intended to put it. Silas Crow's revolver went into the snow. Then Silas Crow went into the snow. The valley was quiet. The wind moved through the spruce above the tree line, and the frozen creek ran under its ice, and somewhere on the east slope a horse that had lost its rider was standing in the snow looking at nothing in particular. Clara stood in the center of the valley floor for a moment. Her shoulder hurt. The rifle was heavy in her hands. The cold was the same cold it had been all morning, and it was going to be cold for several more months, and she was going to be here for all of those months, and that was fine. That was more than fine. She thought about her father. She thought about the deed in her coat. She thought about Jonah in the lodge, hurt but alive, and Cole with his cracked ribs, and the 9 years of careful building that had made this valley into the thing it was. She walked back to the lodge. She went through the open door and set the rifle against the wall and crossed to Jonah and put her hand on the side of his face, and he looked up at her, and she looked at him, and there was nothing. Either of them needed to say that wasn't already there. "It's done," she said. He put his hand over hers. His hand was cold, and hers was cold, and the stove was working hard against the January morning coming through the open door. "Not done," he said. His voice was rough. "Not done. Just this part." She understood what he meant. The lawyers and the territorial offices, and the work of proving what had happened here and what had happened to her father that was all still ahead. The mine, the decisions about what to do with it and how to do it, and what kind of people they intended to be about it. Spring and whatever the spring brought. This part, she agreed. Cole exhaled from the wall, a sound that managed to contain both relief and the complaint of injured ribs in equal measure. "If someone wants to close that door," he said, "the rest of us would appreciate it." Clara went and closed the door. She closed it on the valley and the snow and the scattered aftermath of the morning. And the lodge was warm inside, and the fire was going, and the three of them were alive. Which was the whole thing, really. That was what it came to. After all of it, that was what it came to. She sat down in the chair across from Jonah and looked at the maps still spread across the table, the Badlands survey and the valley approaches, and all the careful work of figuring out how to hold a thing worth holding. Outside, the mountain was quiet. The January light came through the high window and fell across the maps and across Jonah's hands and across the table, where they had spent 2 months learning to trust each other and plan and fight and not flinch from hard conversations. And it was the same light it had always been, cold and clear and indifferent and entirely, completely real. The days after the battle had a strange quality to them. Not peace exactly. Peace was too clean a word for what it was. It was more like the particular silence that follows a very loud noise. When your ears are still adjusting, and the world is the same world it was before, but you're perceiving it differently, because something fundamental has shifted in how you relate to it. The valley was the same valley. The lodge was the same lodge. The stove needed feeding every 4 hours, and the water barrel needed checking every morning, and the spruce outside the north window made the same sound it always made when the wind came off the peaks. All of that was unchanged. What had changed was everything underneath it. Jonah's wound kept him in the chair for the first 2 days, whether he liked it or not, and he did not like it. And he made this clear in the particular way he made most things clear, which was by not saying it directly, but by radiating a specific quality of frustration that filled the room the way weather fills a valley. He was not a man built for stillness. Clara had understood this about him for weeks, but watching him be forcibly still made her understand it differently, the way you understand something differently when you see it under pressure versus when you simply know it as a fact. She changed his bandaging twice a day. She was not gentle about it, and he did not ask her to be, which was its own kind of communication. She had learned enough from watching him work on injured men that she knew what the wound needed, which was cleanliness and pressure and time. And she provided the first 2 with the same focused competence she'd brought to everything else she'd learned in this valley. And the third was providing itself. Cole's ribs were cracked in 2 places, which he'd known immediately because he'd cracked ribs before he said this with the matter-of-fact tone of a man cataloging a familiar experience rather than complaining about a fresh one. There was nothing to do for cracked ribs except breathe carefully and wait, and Cole was experienced at waiting. He sat at the table in the evenings and drank Jonah's coffee and told stories about his years as a deputy in a way that managed to be both informative and entertaining, which Clara appreciated because the evenings in those first days had a weight to them that needed something to push against. On the third day, the surrendered man became a problem they had to solve. His name was Hector Pruitt. He was 26 from somewhere in Nebraska, and he had come to work for Crow's operation 2 years earlier because the pay was better than anything else he'd been offered, and he'd been making decisions by the standard of immediate financial need for his entire adult life, without examining what those decisions added up to. He sat in the corner of the lodge and ate what they gave him and didn't cause trouble, which Clara suspected was less about good character and more about being surrounded by people who had just defeated 20 armed men and were therefore not an optimal target for trouble. On the third morning, she sat down across from him with coffee and the particular directness she'd developed over the past 2 months, which was not unkind, but was not interested in preliminaries. "What do you want to do?" she asked him. He looked at her. "Ma'am, when you leave here," she said, "what do you want to do with your life?" He seemed confused by the question, which told her a lot about how his life had been structured until now. I hadn't thought about it. Think about it now," she said. He thought about it, or performed thinking about it, while she watched. "I can work cattle," he said finally, "and I can work horses." "That's mostly what I've done. Then that's what you'll do," she said. "When we get to Bitter Creek, you'll give a full account of everything you know about Crow's operation, who he employed, what he ordered, who carried out his instructions. You'll give that account to the federal marshal, not the local sheriff, because the local sheriff is dead. In return for a complete and honest account, I'll speak on your behalf regarding your cooperation." He stared at her. "You'd do that if you're honest," she said. "Completely honest. If I find out you've omitted anything significant, the offer goes away." He thought about this for a moment. What happens to Crow's ranches? His operations? "That's for the courts to determine," she said. "But Crow's network was built on a specific kind of coercion. When that's fully documented and prosecuted, a significant amount of what he owned is going to need new management." She picked up her coffee. "People who know cattle and horses are going to be useful in that process." He looked at her steadily. She could see him calculating not in the predatory way that Crow calculated, but in the basic human way of someone trying to figure out whether they were being offered something real. "You're not what I expected," he said. "No," she said. "I know." She left him with his coffee and went to the table where Jonah was doing what he'd been doing for the past 2 days, which was working on the valley maps, despite being ordered to rest, because the order to rest was interpreted by him as applying to physical activity and not to the continuous operation of his mind, which she had given up arguing about. "He'll cooperate," she said, sitting down. "You sound certain," Jonah said without looking up. "He's not a bad man," she said. "He's a man who made a series of decisions without adding them up. That's fixable if he wants to fix it." She looked at the map he was working on, not the valley, she realized, but the Badlands. The gold deposit. He'd been working on it in pieces for 2 days, adding detail, refining the calculations. "How do we do this?" she said. "Do what?" She gestured at the map. "The mine. We talked about it after." "This is after." He set down the pencil. He looked at her with the full attention he gave to things he was taking seriously, which was the same attention he gave to everything, but more noticeably so when the subject was important. "The wrong way is to sell the claim to a large concern," he said. "Come in. They extract. They take 90 cents of every dollar out of the territory. And Bitter Creek gets the noise and the damage, and maybe 2 decades of work before the vein is gone and they leave." He paused. "That's how it's been done in California and Nevada and Colorado. The land gets stripped and the money goes east, and the people who live on it are left with a hole in the ground. And the right way," she said. "Develop it ourselves," he said. "Slowly, capitalized correctly, not over-leveraged. Hire locally, pay fairly, build the infrastructure to process on site rather than shipping raw ore. It takes longer to profit. It requires more patience than most investors have. He met her eyes. But the money stays in the territory. The people who work it have actual stake in it. And when the vein eventually runs, because it will, everything runs eventually. There's something built that outlasts it. She looked at the map. She thought about her father buying this land with borrowed money from Silas Crow, which was the specific irony of it that Crow had inadvertently financed the thing that was now Clara's by right and by deed. That the man who'd tried to take everything had, in the beginning, provided the capital that made it possible to protect it. "We'll need a lawyer," she said. "A good one. From outside the territory, someone Crow's network hasn't touched." "I know one in Denver," Jonah said. "Margaret Ellsworth. She's the best mining attorney between here and San Francisco." Clara looked at him. "You know a woman mining attorney?" "I do," he said. "She's been practicing for 12 years. She's argued 3 cases before the Territorial Supreme Court and won all 3. She's the person I mentioned in Denver, who waited and eventually stopped. The room was quiet for a moment. Clara absorbed this. "Is that going to be a problem?" she asked carefully. He looked at the map. "Not on her end," he said. "Margaret made her peace with that situation a long time ago. She's practical." A pause, "and she's the best person for this job." "Then we contact her," Clara said, "as soon as we can get word to Denver." He nodded. He picked up the pencil. "Spring," he said, "when the pass is open. We go to Bitter Creek, first deal with the legal situation there, then send word to Denver." "We go to Bitter Creek," she said. Together, he looked up. "I'm not staying here while you handle it," she said. "It's my claim, my father's murder, my testimony." "I wasn't suggesting you stay," he said. "You had a tone," she said. "I don't have tones," he said. "You absolutely have tones," she said. "You have several of them, and I've learned to read all of them." He looked at her for a moment, with an expression she'd learned to recognize as him deciding whether to pursue this or let it go. He let it go, which was the correct decision, and she knew he knew it, which was its own small satisfaction. Cole laughed from the corner. He had been pretending to be asleep. For the past several minutes, she was fairly sure. "I'm awake," Cole said. "We know," Clara said. The weeks that followed had their own rhythm. Jonah healed faster than he should have, which she attributed to the fact that he'd spent 9 years being extremely healthy, and the body has a kind of capital it draws on in situations like this. By the end of the 2nd week, he was moving carefully but without assistance. By the 3rd week, he was outside again, which she'd stopped trying to prevent because the effort cost more than the result was worth. Hector Pruitt turned out to be genuinely useful. He knew horses and he knew cold weather animal management, and he took over the care of the horses that had been left in the valley after the battle, 3 of them. The ones that hadn't been injured and hadn't run, with the focused competence of someone doing the thing they were actually good at. Clara watched him work with the animals and thought that the world was full of people who had ended up in the wrong place, because the wrong place was where the money was, and who would have been perfectly decent human beings under different circumstances. She didn't share this thought with Jonah, who she suspected would have pointed out that decent human beings were still responsible for the choices they made, regardless of circumstance. Which was also true, and which was the frustrating thing about most real questions they didn't resolve neatly on one side. On the 22nd day after the battle, a federal marshal named Douglas Sherrill appeared at the valley in the company of 2 deputies and a man in a city coat who turned out to be a representative of the territorial governor's office. They came up the east approach on horseback, which was passable again, Jonah having cleared the worst of the debris after his wound allowed him to work, and they arrived at the lodge looking like men who had not expected the journey to take as long as it had, and who were reconsidering their assumptions about what the high country involved. Sherrill was a compact, watchful man about 50, who had the eyes of someone who had spent his career sorting truth from the versions of truth that people offered when they were worried about consequences. He sat at the table with his hat in his hands and looked at the 3 of them, Clara, Jonah, Cole, and then at Hector Pruitt, and then back at the 3 of them. Start from the beginning, he said, and don't skip anything. It took 4 hours. Clara did most of the talking, with Jonah and Cole adding specifics when she moved past something they had particular knowledge of. She told it the same way she kept the lodge, nothing wasted, nothing omitted, everything in its proper place. Cheryl asked questions that were good questions, the kind that were designed to test consistency rather than trip her up, and she answered them consistently because she was telling the truth, which was an underrated advantage in these situations. When it was done, Cheryl was quiet for a while. He looked at the maps on the table and at the medical kit that had clearly been heavily used, and at the marks on the wall of the lodge where something had hit it during the battle and left evidence of the impact. Silas Crow, he said. It wasn't a question. Yes, Clara said. And you, he looked at her. You fired the shot. Yes, she said. He nodded slowly, not approvingly or disapprovingly. Just acknowledging. The territorial governor's office has been wanting to look into Crow's operations for 3 years, he said. The problem was that every witness we found had a reason to stay quiet. He glanced at Cole. Deputy Cole, your report from 2 months ago was what got the federal office involved. When you went missing, we started moving. Cole looked mildly surprised. My report, he said. The one you sent to the territorial marshal's office in September, Cheryl said. Before Crow's people got to your knee, I sent that report and heard nothing back, Cole said. I thought it had been buried. It took time to verify, Cheryl said. These things take time. He looked at Clara. Miss Mercer, your father's death is going to be reclassified as homicide. The investigation will take time. But with the evidence from Crow's operation, his papers, his correspondence, the testimony of his former employees, I'm confident we'll be able to establish what happened and who ordered it. He paused. I'm sorry about your father. From what I've learned, he was a man who did right when it cost him something. Clara looked at the table. She let herself feel that for a moment the specific relief of someone else saying it plainly, of the record being corrected, father's name, moving from the category of accident victim to the category of man who had been killed for doing the right thing and whose death was going to be acknowledged as such. It wasn't justice. Justice was a word for tidy resolutions, and this was not going to be tidy. But it was something. Thank you, she said. Cheryl turned to Jonah. And the gold claim. The deed is registered and valid, Jonah said. He nodded toward Clara. It's in her name. The original filing was in a different county, which is why Crow's people didn't locate it. We have the original document. Clara produced the deed from her coat, from the lining that her father had sewn it into, which she had left intact, because she found she was not ready to remove it from where he had put it. She laid it on the table. Cheryl looked at it without touching it. The governor's representative leaned forward and examined it with the attention of someone checking a thing against a mental checklist. He looked up and nodded. Valid, he said. The filing is on record. We confirmed it before we came up. Clara looked at the deed on the table. She thought about the day her father had handed her the coat, about the weight of what he'd sewn into it, not just the document, but the intention, the act of a man doing the last careful thing he could do for the person he loved most. She folded the deed and put it back where it was. They stayed 2 more days, Cheryl and his deputies, gathering everything they needed: statements, evidence from the battle site, the testimony of Hector Pruitt, who gave his account fully and without omission, as agreed. Cheryl interviewed each of them separately, which was standard practice, and the accounts aligned precisely, which was not because they'd coordinated them, but because they were all describing the same events from different vantage points. And the events were what they were. On the morning of the 3rd day, Cheryl pulled on his coat and looked at Clara in the particular way of a man who has seen a lot of things and is adding this to the list. There are going to be people in the territory who say you had no right to do what you did, he said. To defend that claim, to fight for it. I know, Clara said. They're wrong, he said, but they'll say it anyway. You should be prepared for that. I've been preparing for things I didn't expect for several months, she said. I expect I can manage what I do expect. Something moved briefly in his face that might have been a smile. Yes, he said, I expect you can. He left with his deputies and with Hector Pruitt, who went with the understanding that his cooperation would be noted and his future evaluated by what he chose to do with it. As he was leaving, Pruitt stopped and looked back at Clara. That thing you asked me, he said, what I wanted to do with my life. I remember, she said. I don't know yet, he said. But I'm going to think about it, for real this time. That's a start, she said. He nodded and went with Cheryl's party down the east approach, and she watched them go. And she thought that was probably the most honest thing he'd said in several years, and that honesty was always a start, even when it didn't feel like much. The valley was quiet for the first time in 3 weeks. She stood outside the lodge and listened to the quiet and let herself feel the size of it. The mountain air was still cold, but there was something different in it, something she'd learned to read over the past months, a quality that meant the cold had stopped getting worse. It was still winter. It would be winter for another 2 months, possibly more. But the direction had shifted, subtly, the way a tide shifts, and she knew now that spring was coming, even though it was still too far away to see. Jonah came to stand beside her. His left side was still bothering him. She could see it in how he held himself, but he was past the point where it limited him significantly, and she had stopped monitoring it in the way she'd monitored it in those first weeks. They stood in the cold and looked at the valley together. We need to talk about the spring, she said. I know, he said. There's going to be a lot of it, she said. The legal process. The claim development. Dealing with Crow's network as it unravels, there are going to be people who try to move into the space half left, and they'll see the Badlands claim as available if we're not clearly occupying it. I know, he said again. Bitter Creek is going to be different, she said. Without Crow, the town loses the thing that's been organizing its fear. That's not automatically good fear. Organizing a town is one kind of problem. A town with no organizing principle at all is another kind of problem. He looked at her sideways. You're planning to do something about that. Someone has to, she said. The bank is gone. Crow's credit structure collapsed with him. The ranchers who were under his thumb are going to need access to honest credit, honest legal services, honest infrastructure. My father spent 11 years trying to build that. She paused. I don't see why I can't continue it. Jonah was quiet for a moment. From here, he said, or from there. It was the question she'd been sitting with for weeks. The valley and the mine and the life she'd built here, however strange its origins, versus Bitter Creek and her father's work, and the town that had stood silent while she was nearly dragged away, and that now, without its organizing tyrant, was going to need to figure out what it was. Both, she said. I think it has to be both. He looked at the peaks. That's a lot, he said. I know, she said. I'm not asking you to be part of all of it. He looked at her then. I didn't say I wasn't. She looked back at him. Scar on his jaw was familiar to her now, in the way that everything about him was familiar, not diminished by familiarity, but somehow larger, more specific, more real than the first impression of it had been. The scarred engineer who had lived alone for 9 years because honesty had cost him the world below, and he hadn't been able to find a version of the world below that was worth the compromise. The man who had come down out of the mountains for one reason and had found, in the process of executing that reason, that there were other reasons, newer ones, that he hadn't anticipated and hadn't planned for. Are you asking me something? She said. He looked back at the valley. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he was going to do the thing he sometimes did, which was redirect to practicalities, when the conversation moved into territory he didn't have efficient language for. 9 years ago, he said, I came up here because I was done. With the compromising and the maneuvering and the way things worked below and the price of participation in all of it. He paused. I built this place because I wanted something honest. Something that was what it was, where the work was real and the result was real, and there wasn't a layer of performance over everything. You built something real, she said. This is real. It was also lonely, he said. It came out simply, without drama, the way true things came out when he said them. Not all the time, but enough, she waited. I'm not good at, he stopped. I have a brother I write to twice a year, a woman in Denver who has moved on and deserved to. I have never been good at the things that require you to stay. He looked at her. I don't know how to tell you that I want to stay in a way that doesn't sound like I'm making you a promise I don't know if I can keep. She thought about what her father had written in the margin of the deed. Trust him the way I did. She thought about what that meant from a man who had been slow to trust and careful about it and almost never wrong. You came down the mountain, she said, for a letter that took 3 weeks to reach you from a man who was already dead by the time you got it. You spent $7,000 in raw gold you'd spent years collecting. You came down for me, for someone you'd never met, because Elias Mercer asked you to, and Elias Mercer was someone whose word meant something to you. She met his eyes. I don't need a promise about the future. I need to know that when something matters to you, you don't leave it behind just because it's difficult. He looked at her steadily. I don't leave things behind, he said. That's also a problem, in its way. I held on to that gold for 6 years waiting for the right moment. I stayed in this valley when going down would have been easier. He stopped. I am not a man who leaves things that matter to him. I know, she said. I've been watching you for 4 months. He was quiet for another moment. Then he said, I would like to stay. It came out simply the same way the true things came out. No performance. Just the statement, plain and real, offered the way he'd offered his hand in the middle of that street in October, not with flourish or demand, just extended, the choice clearly hers. Then stay, she said. They stood in the cold for a while longer, not needing to fill it with anything else. The valley around them had the quality it always had in the late winter. Afternoons, the light going golden off the peaks, the shadows coming down from the east, the temperature dropping in a way that was familiar now and no longer alarming. She knew what this cold was. She knew how to dress for it and how to move in it and how to read the sky above it for what was coming next. She had learned a lot of things in 4 months that she hadn't known at the beginning of October. Some of them were practical. Some of them were harder to name. She had learned that fear and courage were not opposites, that you could be genuinely, physically afraid and still do the thing you were afraid of, and that this did not make the fear go away, but it made it matter less, which was the actual point. She had learned that trust was built the same way everything useful was built slowly, from real materials, tested under real conditions, and not pretty in the way that untested things were pretty, but solid in a way that untested things never were. She had learned that the people who abandon you in your worst moment are not necessarily evil. Some of them are just afraid, in the ordinary human way, afraid of the cost of standing up, afraid of what happens to people who stand up in front of the wrong kind of power. That didn't excuse them, but understanding it kept her from the kind of comprehensive bitterness that would have made the work ahead harder than it needed to be. She had learned that her father had known her better than she'd known herself, and that the things he'd taught her stay standing. Be honest. Do the math and then do what the math says were not the incidental lessons of a banker, but the architecture of a life that could withstand actual pressure. She hadn't understood that while he was alive. She understood it now. Spring came the way the mountain said it would after she'd learned to read what the mountain said. Slowly, then with sudden accelerating urgency, the snow pulling back from the south-facing slopes first and then from the valley floor, the creek shedding its ice in sections over the course of a week until it was running clear and loud over its bed, and the first green things coming up through the last patches of snow with the particular insistence of things that have been waiting a long time and have decided they're done waiting. They went down to Bitter Creek in April. The 4 of them, Clara, Jonah, Cole, whose ribs had healed, and who had decided to come back to his town because it was his town, whatever state it was in, and the 3 horses that had been left in the valley and had spent the winter being well cared for by a man trying to make better decisions. The ride down took 2 days. They made camp the first night at the base of the high country where the timber thinned and the trail widened into something a wagon could navigate. And Clara sat by the fire and looked back up at the peaks in the dark and felt the particular feeling of returning from somewhere that had changed you to a place that doesn't know yet what happened. Bitter Creek had changed, not in ways that were visible immediately. The 2 blocks of Main Street were still held together by habit and necessity, the same buildings, the same dust that had turned to mud in the April thaw. But the quality of the air was different. Silas Crow had been the weather of this town for 30 years, the thing that determined what was possible and what wasn't, what you said and what you kept quiet about. And his absence was in the air the way a change in weather pressure is in the air you felt it before you had evidence for it. People came out of buildings when they rode in. Not a crowd. Not the organized audience of the October street scene, just people appearing, stopping what they were doing, watching. The hardware store owner, who Clara's father had done business with for a decade. The woman who ran the dry goods, who had been at the street scene in October and had been one of the ones who looked away. 2 of the cowboys who'd been standing at the back of the crowd that morning. Nobody said anything immediately. The silence had that specific quality of people deciding, in real time, what version of themselves they were going to be. Clara stopped her horse in the middle of the street. She looked at the people looking at her. She thought about the last time she had stood in the center of this street and the 40 people who'd watched and said nothing, and the question of what a community owed to its members when the cost of standing up felt too high. She had been angry about that. She was less angry now. Not because it hadn't been wrong, it had been wrong, and the people who had stood silent knew it was wrong, and the knowing was going to be with them in one way or another for a long time. But she had learned something in the mountains about what fear does to ordinary people, and she had decided that the work ahead required her to deal with what was actually there rather than what she wished had been there. "My name is Clara Mercer," she said, not loudly, just clearly to the street and the people on it. "My father was Elias Mercer, who ran this bank for 11 years. What happened to him was murder, and it's going to be prosecuted. What was done to this town and the ranches around it is going to be addressed through the federal courts. And anyone who was coerced into arrangements with Crow's operation has the right to bring testimony to the federal marshal's office." She looked at the faces looking back at her. "I'm going to rebuild the bank. It's going to operate the way my father operated it honestly, and with terms that make sense, and without using debt as a weapon. If you have questions about any of this, I'll be at the building this afternoon." She rode on to the former bank building, which had been padlocked since the liquidation notice, but which was, as of the deed transfer and the territorial court order that Cheryl had processed, hers again. Jonah came up beside her. "That was well said," he said. "I've had time to think about what I wanted to say," she said. "You still nervous?" "Enormously," she said. "Don't tell anyone." "Who would I tell?" he said. She looked at him. He was looking at the bank building with his engineering eyes, assessing, cataloging what needed doing. She recognized the look. It was the same look he'd given the Eastern approach 2 months before the battle, not overwhelmed by the problem, just measuring it. Figuring out what was real and what could be done about what was real. She had grown very fond of that look. The federal proceedings took the better part of 6 months. Cheryl was thorough, and the governor's office was motivated, and the evidence from Crow's operation turned out to be even more extensive than any of them had anticipated. Crow had been meticulous about record-keeping, which had served him in managing his network, and now served the prosecution in dismantling it. 17 members of his operation were indicted. 12 were convicted. The coroner who'd ruled Elias Mercer's death and accident was among them. The ranchers who'd been operating under coercive arrangements with Crow had their debts restructured or cleared entirely, depending on the circumstances. Several of them came to the bank's reopening in June, a modest event, held on a Tuesday morning because it was a working day, and the point was that it was working. Not ceremonial, and they sat in the chairs that Clara's father had sat in clients in for 11 years. Across the desk that Clara had inherited along with the room, and they talked about what they needed and what was possible. and she listened with the particular attention she'd learned from two people who were good at listening. Her father and Jonah, each in their own way. Margaret Ellsworth came from Denver in July. She was 42 precise, wore sensible clothes and excellent boots, and had the manner of someone who had spent 12 years being the smartest person in the room in situations where that made the other people in the room uncomfortable, and had made her peace with that being the situation. She and Clara met at the bank on the first morning and talked for 4 hours about the Badlands claim and what developing it responsibly meant in practical and legal terms. At the end of the 4 hours, Margaret Ellsworth sat back and looked at Clara with an expression that Clara was familiar with the one people got when they'd expected one thing and encountered another. "You know this claim better than most mine owners know their operations," Margaret said. "I had a good teacher," Clara said. "Rusk," Margaret said. "Not with any particular weight, just acknowledging." "Among others," Clara said, "my father spent 2 years on the geology. Jonah spent 5 years refining it. I spent 4 months learning as much of it as I could." She looked at the survey maps spread between them. "It's my land. I'm going to understand it." Margaret looked at her for another moment. "I'd like to meet with both of you tomorrow," she said. "There are some structural questions about how the development entity should be organized that need input from both sides." "I'll arrange it," Clara said. Margaret stood and gathered her papers and then paused. "For what it's worth," she said, "I have been doing this work for 12 years. And the number of people, men or women, who have come to me with a claim this significant and this well-documented and this clearly thought through. I can count on one hand." She looked at Clara steadily. "Your father's instincts about who to trust were good." "I know," Clara said. "He was good at people." She paused. "He was also good at hiding things in coat linings." Margaret almost smiled. "I'll see you tomorrow," she said. The meeting the next day was efficient and unsentimental, which was appropriate given the parties involved. Jonah and Margaret Ellsworth were cordial with each other in the way of two people who had once mattered to each other and had arrived through different roads over different years, at a genuine mutual respect that was separate from the older and more complicated thing. Clara watched this and found it told her something about both of them that she hadn't known before. The development entity was structured with Clara holding primary ownership, Jonah holding a significant technical partnership stake in recognition of his 7 years of survey and engineering work on the claim, and a management structure that hired locally first and brought in outside expertise only where it couldn't be developed locally. Margaret drafted the agreements in language that was clear enough to be understood without a law degree, and airtight enough to survive a challenge,
which was a rare combination that cost accordingly and was worth every dollar.
Jonah argued about one of the payment terms for about 20 minutes before Clara said flatly that she was not going to argue about it anymore, and that was the term, and he looked at her with that expression and accepted it. Margaret, who observed this exchange, said nothing but made a notation on her papers that she did not explain. The boring work on the Badlands site began in October, exactly 1 year after the morning that Silas Crow had put his hand on Clara Mercer's wrist in the middle of a street in front of 40 people who had looked at their boots. Clara stood at the first bore site and watched the crew set up the equipment and thought about the strange specific arithmetic of how things happened, the geometry of cause and effect that made that morning in October the start of something rather than the end. Jonah stood beside her. He'd been out to the site twice already with the survey crew, laying out the bore positions with the precision of a man who had been waiting 9 years to do this particular work and intended to do it exactly right. "First bore," she said. "Yes," he said. "Are you nervous?" He thought about it. "No," he said. "The geology is what it is. The bore is going to find what's there. I've been certain about what's there for 7 years." "Confident," she said. "Certain," he said. "There's a difference." She looked at him. "Is there anything you're not certain about?" He was quiet for a moment. The bore crew was moving equipment into position, calling to each other across the site, doing the work of men who were getting started on something significant, and knew it. "Some things," he said. such as he looked at her. The scar on his jaw was familiar. The steadiness of his eyes was familiar. Everything about him was familiar in the way that things become familiar when you have seen them in ordinary circumstances and extraordinary ones. When you have disagreed with them and relied on them and been afraid alongside them and trusted them in the specific way, you trust someone who has never tried to make themselves seem better than they are. Whether I'm going to be as useful at the things that come next as I was at the things that came before, he said. The mountain work, the survey work, the parts that were mine to know. The next part involves more people, more decisions. More it requires something I'm less practiced at. Working with people, she said. Working with a lot of people, he said. Yes, you worked with me, she said. One person, he said. One person is a different problem than you worked with Cole, she said. Two people. Hector Pruitt, Clara, Margaret Ellsworth, she said. He looked at her. That's 4 people, she said, and not simple ones either. That's 4 people in difficult circumstances under significant pressure, and you navigated all of it without doing anything I'd classify as working with people badly. She paused. You're better at it than you think. You just don't like it. He considered this. Those are different things, he said. Yes, she said, and the second one isn't a problem. Plenty of people do necessary things they don't love. That's just what it is to do work that matters. The first bore bit hit stone, and the sound of it changed, and everyone on the site went a little quieter. Jonah watched the crew. She watched him watching the crew. There was a story she'd been thinking about for months, since Cheryl had come up the mountain, and since the legal proceedings had begun, and since the world below had slowly absorbed what had happened and started rearranging itself around it. The story was about what a person was worth. Not in the financial sense she had the Badlands claim for that, but in the sense of what a person amounted to, what they left behind them, what the people who came after them could do with what they left. Her father had left her a deed and a coat with a hidden pocket and a name written in a margin. He'd left her 11 years of a bank run on honest principles. He'd left her a town that, stripped of the thing that had been oppressing it, was now making cautious, awkward, genuine efforts to be the town it should have been all along. He'd left her a partner who had kept faith with him for 9 years, and who had come down a mountain at the right moment and done the exact right thing, and who was standing beside her, now watching the first bore turn into this hillside that her father had bought with borrowed money and protected with his life. That was what a person was worth, not the gold underneath. The work that got you to the gold, and the people standing beside you when you found it. She put her hand in Jonah's, not dramatically, just her hand in his, the way you do when you're standing next to someone in the cold and you're both watching something start. His hand closed around hers, warm for once. The October sun was out, and the work was beginning, and the bore bit ground down through the shale toward what was there, what had always been there, waiting to be reached by people patient and honest and stubborn enough to reach it. It's going to come in big, Jonah said. I know, she said. Bigger than the survey indicated, probably. The indicators on the north side. Jonah, she said, yes, stop doing geology for 5 minutes. He was quiet. He looked at the bore site. He looked at their hands. He looked at the sky above the Badlands, which was the particular clear blue of an October day in Wyoming. The same color it had been a year ago when this started, and would be 100 years from now, when whatever was built here had become whatever it had become. 5 minutes, he said. 5 minutes, she agreed. They stood there in the autumn sun, not talking, while the bore crew worked and the bit went down and the land gave up its first small account of what it held. The sound of it carried across the flat Badlands air, steady and real and full of what comes next. She thought about the woman who had stood in a street in October with 40 people looking at their boots, and the distance between that woman and this one. The distance was not as large as it looked from the outside. The woman in the street had been afraid and alone, and had made the most important decision of her life in about 3 seconds. She had taken a stranger's hand and walked into the mountains, and decided that whatever came next was going to be faced rather than fled. That decision hadn't changed who she was. It had just revealed it. She had been this woman the whole time. She had just needed somewhere to become her. The boar hit something at 43 feet that made the crew foreman stop and look at his instruments, and then look at Jonah with the expression of a man confirming something he'd been told but hadn't quite believed until this moment. Jonah looked at the foreman. "Tell me," he said. The foreman told him. Jonah's hand tightened around Clara's. Just briefly. Just enough. Your father was right. She looked at the boar site and at the crew and at the Badlands that had looked like nothing to everyone who had ever passed through them, that had been dismissed and overlooked and undervalued the way certain things get overlooked because the value isn't on the surface. He usually was, she said. The sun was out and the work was real and the boar went deeper, and Clara Mercer, who had begun the year as a debtor's daughter in a dress she'd worn twice already, standing alone in a street while 40 people looked at their boots, stood on her own land with her hand in the hand of a man who had learned to stay, and watched the future open up like a vein of gold in the honest Wyoming earth. It was not a smooth ending. There would be lawyers for another 2 years, and territorial disputes, and the specific grinding difficulty of building something large in a world designed to make building things large difficult for people who weren't already powerful. There would be arguments between her and Jonah, real ones, about how to proceed and when to be patient and when to push. There would be nights when the weight of what had happened her father, the street, the cold months in the valley, the morning of the battle came down on her fully and had to be lived through rather than resolved. But this moment was real. The ground under her feet was real. The gold beneath it was real, confirmed now by 43 feet of bore into the earth her father had bought with his last borrowed money and protected with his life. She had claimed it, not easily, not cleanly, not without cost. But she had claimed it, and it was hers, and she was standing on it. That was enough. That was, she had learned, exactly enough.